Oh, hi. Guess you haven't seen me around for a while, have you? Been busy. Been busy in the real world. So, if you haven't heard, Mama Suit. Same Mama Suit that fought cancer 4 years ago and won. Unfortunately, the cancer came back. And she didn't win this time. On 23rd of November 2022. She lost her fight with cancer. Rest in peace, Mama Suit.
And the other question, remember how I mentioned this morning about extra fluids like these ones and a tube in the nose and stuff? That will also only buy you maybe a day or two. None of that. So seems it's not the rule. It's what is chosen as actually the most compassionate way. Because what we're doing is we're fighting, she's not having a good quality of life with this illness at this stage. And if we do all these things that we would do if you get sick, for example, we're just making the suffering longer. Okay, so I've asked this so that you guys know that it's been her choice. Yeah. And we will follow that, and that also means that you two don't have to make decisions about that. What you need to do is just be here for her. Yeah. And be here for her as much as you all need as a family. Okay?
So you don't want no antibiotics, you don't want no chemo? No nothing.
Vaughan says she doesn't think the chemo is going to do anything. She really thinks that it's constant.
So it's now up to God, hey? It's now up to God. God? Well, God provides miracles, right? Surely, if Mum's God could do what she believed he could do, I mean, she dedicated her life to this God. She was not an evil person. So surely God could do something, right? If he wanted to. Of course, when medicine can do nothing, we turn to spirituality, to religion. To gods, we prayed. To no avail, because when we pray, we're just talking to ourselves. Because there is no fucking God. And this is where I'm gonna upset some of my religious followers. But it's okay, because you can pray for me. As you can imagine, it's been a heck of a week. Heck of a couple of weeks. Especially the week of Mum's passing. Not only did Mum pass, but I was targeted by a they, them, she, shit, ze, zer, it, trans idiot on Twitter, which eventually got my Twitter suspended for replying that he was a biological man, which is fact. This is on Elon's Twitter, by the way, so I have appealed it, still waiting for it to be appealed. At the same time, I lost my monetization on YouTube, so they targeted that. They couldn't get the video down, which was a 5-hour documentary I put together with another YouTuber a little while ago and uploaded. Speaking of those people who want to mess around with little kiddies and more. So, of course, you know, those type of people, they love children. So, yeah, nothing in the documentary was wrong or false, so it couldn't be taken down. But the monetization was lost, so if you want to donate, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, by PayPal. Yeah, we cried. I cried. Still crying. if you loved your mum and your mum passes away and you don't cry, there's something fucking wrong with you. So yeah, I'm still very upset. I was mad, very mad at God. So I went around and obviously we did the praying prior to Mum passing away. We were at the churches. We asked the churches why it didn't work. They had no answer, of course, and, well, they had the usual answers. It's part of God's plan. Trust in God. Have faith in God. It wasn't God who took you away. It was Satan who put the disease there that took her away. Blah, blah, fucking blah. The usual shit. So I asked some other Christian friends that I know. And of course, we got the same answers. From one of them especially, I was blown away. This one person, a close friend of mine, I thought would have many intellectual arguments and answers for me. No doubt, of course, said that they cannot speak on behalf of God, but then turned it all around and attempted to make it that I was questioning them and ridiculing them and making them look like a laughing stock in front of everyone else. It's like, what the fuck, dude? This is not about you. This was about me asking questions. So as per usual, couldn't get any answers from the usual suspects. So I had to do some of my own fucking digging, didn't I? Where to begin? Let's begin at the end. The resurrection story, the whole hook of the Bible. One of the most important stories of all time, correct? You know, the resurrection, the death and resurrection, the empty tomb. How many women discovered the empty tomb? I mean, according to the Gospel of John, he says it's 1. Matthew says 2. Mark says 3. Luke says it's even more. I mean, this might be completely irrelevant, right? Doesn't really affect the story in any significant manner. However, remembering what we are talking about here, we are talking about the inspired word of God, reporting on what is one of the single most important events in history. If true, internal consistency is, at the very least, what we should expect from the sources which we are relying on, chosen by God himself and inspired by God himself when telling them. Sure, the answer is easy. Man is flawed. But this is God inspiring his creation to record the single most important event in history. Correct? We are relying on these sources as evidence for this event, and not even God's book, inspired by specifically chosen people to write, could get this one most important event to match up with each other. Does it matter if I ask Bill how many people entered the empty room at 2 a.m. and it is different to the answer Bob gave me? No, because I'm not a god, nor am I inspiring them to write a factual event down in a book, which will later be known as the Book of God that millions will rely on. If I was a god, and if I inspired Bill and Bob to write my chapter of my book for millions to read, you would think I would inspire a little more accuracy. No? What's more, only in the book of Matthew was there a great earthquake felt which moved the stone away from the tomb. You would have thought that the other gospel writers would have at least noticed this and probably thought to include it in their book, or at least would have been inspired to do so. But the others didn't include this remarkable event where angels moved the stone to allow Jesus to rise from the tomb. I suppose we could say it's all a matter of perspective from different eyewitnesses, which is fine. But being the divine book inspired by God, you think he would have picked people who are a bit more consistent. Maybe? What if I told you that Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark didn't write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke, John didn't write John? What if I told you there was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Would you believe me? Even if it was the truth.
Gospel titles and authors. The titles and authors given in the Gospels of the New Testament read in most Bibles in large bold text: the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of John. We as readers are led to assume, and some Bibles outright state, that these books were written by Jesus' disciples and direct eyewitnesses to the events they describe. Matthew being written by, Jesus' disciple Matthew, the former tax collector. John written by John, son of Zebedee, and in the case of Mark, a man connected with Peter, and Luke, named after a traveling companion mentioned by Paul in Colossians. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. As confirmed by early manuscripts of the documents themselves, originally these Gospels were untitled and did not name any sort of author. They were written anonymously, and the authors, whoever they might have been, never wrote their names, nor did they write in the first person or insert themselves into the narratives. This was no secret, or even something that interested early Christians. It was likely assumed at the time that these texts were not written by the disciples or by anyone who had significance in Jesus' life. It's actually quite obvious that the disciples hadn't written these texts when one notes that they were written in Greek by educated Greek speakers, likely outside of Israel, maybe from Greece, Asia Minor, or Egypt. Literacy in the ancient world was rare. By modern estimates, at the best of times in antiquity, only about 10% or so of the population was able to read, and most of these were concentrated in urban areas like cities, and not in the type of areas where Jesus' disciples might have been from. Keep in mind, most of them were fishermen and hard laborers in the countryside. By all accounts, peasants. The ability to read is one thing. In the ancient world, it was another to be able to write and compose a literary work. Few people in the 1st and 2nd centuries would have been able to produce something like the Gospels. The few there were would have been from eastern cities of the Roman Empire, like Alexandria. Most scholars agree that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, and more likely to have been written by urban Christians who were recording oral and written traditions, sayings, and stories about Jesus and his life, passed down, and compiling them in a unified text. The Gospels themselves are not apologetic about this. The Gospel of Matthew is written completely in the third person, using they to refer to the disciples, and never we. The tax collector turned disciple Matthew is never referred to as me, but instead just him. There is zero indication in the actual text that we are supposed to be led to believe this man also wrote what we are currently reading. Same thing with Luke and Mark. The author of the Gospel of John clearly makes a distinction between himself and his informant, an unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved, who was the source of the stories and traditions he is writing down at the end of the Gospel. The end of the Gospel of John reads like this: Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the disciple who has testified to these things and has written them. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. The anonymous author is simply stating he gathered this information for this text from an eyewitness of Jesus, and that he had not met Jesus himself. The author dictated the gospel from this individual, whoever they might have been. It was only traditions made decades after the construction that tried to tie names to these untitled and anonymous texts, and the names just stuck even though there is no factual or textual basis for them, and the texts themselves explicitly argue against it. To early Christians, it didn't matter to them who the authors of these texts were. However, later Christians wanted to bring more authenticity to the documents by making their authors direct eyewitnesses to the events they described. They would essentially take names that are mentioned in the New Testament and say, yeah, that guy wrote this, with no corroborating evidence. The tradition in our modern Bibles of providing names and authors to the Gospels is just not accurate to the original text.
Wow. Although that might not impress most people, and most Christians will say, oh yeah, whatever. Of course it wasn't written by them, but they're the titles that are given to it now. Okay, let he who has no sin cast the first stone. I wonder where that was from. Was it really? Let's find out.
The passage involving Jesus and the adulterous woman, found in the Gospel of John, chapters 7 and 8, also known as the pericope adulterae, is one of the New Testament's most famous stories. Recorded only in the Gospel of John, during one of Jesus' travels, he is confronted in a town by a group of Jewish priests who dragged a woman accused of committing adultery before him. These priests demanded to know if Jesus agreed with the punishment for such a crime, as commanded by Moses, stoning the young woman to death. It was a clever trap. If he agreed, he would make a fool of his own teachings of love and mercy. If he disagreed, he would be violating the Jewish law and contradicting one of God's own prophets. We are told that Jesus calmly and collectively responds to the priests by writing something unknown in the dirt and proclaiming the now famous phrase, "He that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her." The priests and the crowd, upon hearing this, quietly leave, seemingly recognizing they are equally as sinful. Jesus and the accused woman are left alone. The Nazarene tells her, "I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more." To many, this is one of Jesus' most memorable teachings, and it's a dang good passage and message about mercy and forgiveness. It is even depicted in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ as a flashback, though the film adds the detail of the unnamed woman being Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' closest followers, a detail that is not contained in the verses. As beloved as this passage may be, it is almost definitely an addition to the Gospel of John, and not original part of the text. First of all, the story is completely absent in all of our oldest copies of the Gospel of John. It is not found in Papyrus 66 or Papyrus 75, written around 200 AD, nor is it found in either the Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus, written in around the 300s AD. All of these copies of John skip over the account, seemingly flowing directly from the verses prior into the ones that occur after in our modern Bibles. The earliest manuscript that actually contains the story is in the Codex Bezae, which was written in 400s to 500s AD. Other details about the story seem to lend credence to being an edit. As several biblical scholars have noted, it is stylistically distinct from the writing that can be found both before and after it in the text. It uses a large number of words and phrases that are otherwise alien to the rest of the Gospel, again suggesting it was written by a different hand. All the evidence points to this passage being an addition to the original Gospel of John, and very few biblical scholars these days will argue in favor of the passage being authentic. In truth, it appears like it was inserted into the Gospel by a scribe or group of scribes centuries after it was written.
Imagine my shock. And what about Lazarus? In the book of John, he's raised from the dead to prove Christ is who he says he was. Yet, in the book of Luke, the same Lazarus is revealed to be in fact a fictional character, because he appears first in a parable, and secondly, when it is asked if Lazarus can be raised from the dead, Jesus says no. He shouldn't be, because if they're not going to listen to Abraham and the prophets, then they're not going to be persuaded. It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Now, these are small contradictions, sure, but the claim is so large that we should expect a historical accuracy, being the book of God, who inspired these people to write these claims so others would believe. Now, let's presume that these two Lazarus are different stories and different people, two completely different people. Let's say that one is Bill, the other is Bob. The contradiction is not so much in the stories, but in the actions of Jesus. In one case, he will raise one from the dead, but in the other, he shouldn't be raised from the dead. Isn't this alarming to anyone else? No? Your Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, acts in two completely different ways? Bit of a contradiction, I would assume. Would be alarming, unless you just want to believe for the sake of fucking believing and not question the text that you're fucking reading. Now, the book of Luke 24, I believe, there's a story of Cleopas who travels from Jerusalem to Emmaus, if I'm saying that correctly. Upon that road, just after the body of Christ has disappeared, and when on that road, Christ appears and reveals the secrets of the kingdom to Cleopas, and Cleopas goes and tells everyone. Now, Cleopas means tell all or proclaim. Now, compare the above to the earlier Roman story of Proculus traveling to Rome. After Romulus's body had vanished, Romulus appears to Proculus upon the road and reveals the secrets to the empire, and Proculus again goes and tells everyone. Proculus also means proclaim. The similarities between the two stories are too many to be a mere coincidence. They both travel a road, precisely 14 miles long. They both travel from a mountain to a valley, etc., etc. It's quite clear that Cleopas's story is borrowed. That doesn't mean that there's no historical value in the Gospels. What it means is they are riddled with myth, and it's not an easy task to determine what is history and what is not. Yet, this is supposed to be the evidence given to us by the divine inspiration of God. You think he would have made sure that no myth was told within his book that is being written by people he chose to inspire to write it, especially one taken from another not that long ago. But if the only evidence we really have for a bodily resurrection comes from within these texts, then we should be incredibly skeptical before we try and accept it or blindly believe it, especially when the resurrection itself was a stolen myth from another long before the Bible. But that's another story we may get into later. With so many contradictions within the Book of God that was inspired by God, and so many clearly borrowed stories, how can we say that the information within the book is trustworthy? That's some food for thought, isn't it? And what about the virgin birth? Isaiah 7:14. The Hebrew word used there is Alma, a young woman, particularly unmarried, which does not mean virgin. But because the New Testament writers were reading the Greek version of the Old Testament, they saw the word parthenos, which means virgin. So they create the story of the virgin birth. Exodus, slavery, beating a slave with a rod. Oh, okay, it's Old Testament, we don't follow that anymore. Numbers 31. Moses instructs, kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has never slept with a man. Sexual slavery being advocated here? Pedo vibes? Okay, ignore that. Old Testament, right. Winky wink. We don't follow that anymore. And what about the illusion of choice? Choice. Believe in Jesus or burn in hell. Is that really much of a choice? What kind of a God would give a choice like that? That's like me holding a shotgun to your head and saying, kiss my feet or I'll blow your head off. It's a choice, right?
Pagan parallels to Christ. It's a topic that's been rehashed ad nauseum and a theological gauntlet due to misinformation from all sides. On the one hand, you have conspiracy films like Zeitgeist or popular novels like The Da Vinci Code, which overinflate certain parallels and distort the historical record. On the other hand, you have apologetics, which either flatly deny such parallels or minimize them to make a special case for Jesus. Basically, special pleading.
Yeah, this is, Mark, absolutely maddening how just absolutely manufactured out of thin air this argument is, and how it has been so thoroughly refuted by scholars.
A long time ago, right?
A long time ago, you know, in the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, it was refuted, and yet it keeps coming back.
The parallels turned out to be spurious. In fact, there are no parallels in ancient mythology of dying and rising deities.
The history of Jesus is profoundly different than the mythical, and I would put it this way, obviously mythical nature of the pagan gods.
As a specialist on this topic, I'm here to help. Here are 10 actual pagan parallels to Christ that are substantiated by legitimate scholarship and historical sources. As always, sources will be provided throughout, because I'm such a nice guy. Number 1, he was born of a high god and a mortal woman. Many legendary and historical figures were the offspring of some high god and mortal woman, including Alexander the Great, Pythagoras, and Perseus. In the cases of Plato and Epaphus, Zeus impregnated their mothers sans sexual coitus. Where's the fun in that? Number 2, he traveled the countryside, healing the sick, raising the dead, and performing a variety of miracles. Number 3, he turned water into wine. And number 4, he cast out demons. The Greek physician Asclepius healed the lame, the blind, and the paralytic, and even raised the dead. Apollonius of Tyana performed such miracles too, including exorcising demons. As the god of the vine, Dionysus turned water into wine, a miracle that he passed on to some of his devotees. Number 5, he was killed but came back from the dead 3 days later. Number 6, following his death, his body went missing. Number 7, he ascended into heaven. Number 8, he appeared alive again to his followers. Number 9, believers could share in his experience, placing their faith in him, that they too might rise from death and ascend to heaven to join him one day. Number 10, his death was accompanied by miraculous signs and wonders, including earthquakes, darkened skies, and the dead rising from their tombs. The Egyptian Osiris was murdered by his evil brother Set, but raised from the dead by the power of his wife Isis. His resurrection was celebrated on the 3rd day, and it became the means by which others could rise from death to inherit eternal life. Dionysus was dismembered and killed by the Titans, but restored to life as the prototype of his Orphic initiates, his rebirth being a token of their own. Inanna was killed by her sister Erishkigal, but raised up after 3 days and nights. Asclepius was raised from the dead by Zeus to become an immortal god, who continued to perform his healing miracles on earth. The body of Aristaeus went missing after he died in a fuller's shop, yet he was seen alive again by many throughout Sicily. Romulus, first king of Rome, was taken up to heaven in a cloud and made immortal, appearing to a most trusted witness, Proculus Julius, to deliver a great commission. Hercules appeared to his grieving mother, Alcmena, following his tragic death, demanding that she refrain from mourning since he'd been placed in heaven among the gods. Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus also rose to heaven. In fact, the death of Caesar was accompanied by earthquakes, darkened skies, and the silent dead rising from their tombs, just as in Matthew's Gospel. None of this necessarily means that early Christians just borrowed or copied these ideas to create Jesus. It just means that the stories they told about Jesus were consistent with ancient modes of deification. They spring from a common well of mythological ideas in the ancient Mediterranean world, ideas that were equally applied to other historical figures, including Alexander, Augustus, Apollonius, etc. So we shouldn't take this by itself to mean that there was no historical Jesus. But we also shouldn't do what apologists do, which is constantly lie about it, or pretend that it's all true in the case of Jesus, but mythical in every other case.
So, Derek, how did we get Christianity?
One of the best ways to understand basically the emergence and development of early Christianity is that it is very much a Greco-Judaic hybrid. Now, what do I mean by that? In other words, it's almost kind of a perfect blend of Judaism, which was the religion of Jesus and his followers, at that time, Judaism with Hellenism, which were the predominant ideas, philosophies, beliefs of the Greco-Roman world. Because granted, Christianity began as a sect within Judaism, it also arose in a very Hellenized, that means Greekified, Greco-Roman world. After Alexander the Great conquered half the known world in the 4th century BC, and this includes, Palestine, the Levant, you had different peoples, different cultures exposed to one another as never before. And so you had a lot of infusion of Greek ideas into the wider Mediterranean world, and that absolutely includes the Jews. There are apologists who tried to deny this and not successfully, because you did have some Jews who resisted Hellenization, but not all of them did, and we have evidence of that being the case. And Christianity is a prime example of the sort of Hellenized Jewish movement. So that's what Christianity is. It's equal parts Greek, equal parts Jewish. As for the Jewish aspect of it, after the exile to Babylon, when the Jews were taken captive into Babylon around the 6th century BC, many of them hoped for a Davidic king who would restore the nation to independence and sovereignty, as well as usher in the kingdom of God and raise the righteous dead. There were miracle workers, of course, in the Hebrew scriptures like Moses and Elijah. You had exalted and immortalized figures like Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, as well as Jeremiah and the high priest Onias, so according to 2nd Maccabees. A lot of people don't know that. You had scriptural antecedents and templates, so to speak, like Isaiah 52:13 through 53, with the suffering servant who atones for Israel and is raised and highly exalted. Contra evangelicals, this was not really a prediction about Jesus. It concerns Israel during the time of the exile to Babylon. That's why Isaiah speaks of the suffering in the past tense, and he tells us in the preceding chapters and verses that the suffering servant, the servant, is Israel or Jacob. But it became incredibly useful when it came time for whenever Christianity rolled around, whenever Jesus was ostensibly crucified. They looked to passages like this and basically reconciled the tragedy by saying, oh, Jesus is this figure. This was supposed to happen after all. He atoned for our sins, and like the servant here, who is Jesus, he will be raised and highly exalted and placed at God's right hand. So that's just kind of a brief summary of the Jewish background, a very brief summary. And then from Hellenism, from the Greco-Roman world, we have Alexander the Great to thank for this. If it wasn't for Alexander, there'd probably be no Christianity, not here in the modern day. But you had philosophical movements like Stoicism and the Logos. The Logos was the pre-existent spiritual essence behind all things, also the mediator between God and man. So we see that infused in the Pauline letters, as well as the beginning of John's Gospel. Platonic metaphysics, whereby the spiritual realm was superior to the material world. That's why Paul emphasizes Jesus, the risen Jesus, having a spiritual body rather than a body of carnal or flesh and blood, which dies, gets weak, is corruptible. No. This is a spiritual body. He may have meant some type of body by that, but it's not like a fleshly, natural body like we have now. And this is steeped in Platonic ideas with a sort of Jewish twist. Like Asclepius, Jesus heals the lame, the blind, and the paralytic, and raises the dead. Like Aristeas, Romulus, and Heracles, Jesus is immortalized. He's translated to heaven and appears to followers in his post-mortal form. You have similar motifs like missing bodies, the darkening of the skies, being enveloped in a cloud, the dead being raised. In the case of Julius Caesar, at the time of his death, the dead are raised, just like in that passage in Matthew. It's probably where Matthew's getting it, or something like that. Like Osiris and Dionysus, his triumph over death becomes the means by which others can achieve either resurrection or life after death, sometimes through ritual participation in the God's suffering and vindication. You find this in the mystery religions, most notably. Like Caesar Augustus, he is the Son of God and Savior of the world. He bears the same titles as Caesar. And then, like countless other Greco-Roman figures, he is begotten by a high god and a mortal woman. And in a few cases in the Greco-Roman world, it actually is sexless conception, contra the apologists, with Plato and Paphos. Both are begotten by a high god and a mortal woman, and there is no actual intercourse involved. So, again, that's a brief synopsis summary of the Hellenistic background. And so you see that Christianity is very much, as I described, this Greco-Judaic hybrid. It's this perfect blend of these two clashing cultures, the Greco-Roman and the Jewish. It's precisely the kind of religion we would expect to emerge from that time and place in history.
Interesting, isn't it? And we heard something about a high god and a mortal woman. And I think there's a word for that, something about Nephilim, but we'll get back to that in a moment, because that will lead us on another journey. So before we move on, what about salvation, judgment, and hell?
What is one thing, perhaps the biggest thing, that distinguishes believers from non-believers? Granted, there are many, but this in particular is a striking and fundamental distinction. What is that one thing? It is that believers, evangelical Christians, seek to impose their worldview onto others. That is, after all, what evangelism means: to spread the gospel, to infect others with their antiquated myths and superstition. Really take notice of the double standard here. Sure, I post videos deconstructing Christianity, the Bible, and theism in general, primarily because I find the topics inherently fascinating and enjoy educating other like-minded people. But what I don't do, what I never do, is seek to deconvert existing believers. I don't go to other family members, friends, and acquaintances telling them that they should renounce their faith. If you're a believer watching this video right now, I honestly don't care whether or not I change your mind or dissuade you from Christianity. In fact, unless you're truly open-minded, I know that I have no chance of doing so. I've seen firsthand the power of cognitive dissonance reduction and delusion. And frankly, I'm fine with people believing whatever they want, so long as they aren't harming anyone. This is a free country, after all, and I fully support our foundational freedom of religion. I don't argue with friends and neighbors. I don't go door to door with flyers and pamphlets written by Richard Dawkins and Nietzsche. I don't invite believers to freethinker meetings and overnight candlelit baby-eating vigils. I don't message believing friends and family with secular humanist credos and aphorisms. I share my own thoughts, ideas, and research on my own channel and social media, but I don't intrude on anyone else's personal territory. I don't invade their personal bubble. If you don't like what I share, you don't have to follow me. I demand an ear from absolutely nobody who lacks a fundamental interest or agreement with what I'm saying. You're an adult. You know how to enter or show yourself to the door depending on whether you like or agree with my content. Many believers, on the other hand, feel it is their obligation to subject non-believers to their hocus-pocus worldview. imploring us to pray, to go to church, to seek their God, to seek Jesus. That our souls, that our salvation hang in the balance, that judgment cometh soon, and the fiery flames of hell are nipping at our feet. Repent before it's too late. Now, I know this isn't descriptive of all believers, and I hugely appreciate the ones who don't do this, who have the sensibility to respect personal boundaries. But this kind of behavior is characteristic of all too many evangelicals, and just recently it reared its ugly head to someone whom I personally know and care about. Firstly, why do evangelicals do this? As Dr. Robert M. Price explains in The Reason-Driven Life concerning the hidden agenda of witnessing, if you take a close look at evangelism, you begin to see that it has at least as much to do with fortifying the inner conviction of the born-again Christian as it has with saving the unsaved. As Eric Hoffer explains in The True Believer, the missionary zeal seems rather an expression of some deep misgiving, some pressing feeling of insufficiency at the center. Proselytizing is more a passionate search for something not yet found than a desire to bestow upon the world something we already have. It is a search for a final and irrefutable demonstration that our absolute truth is indeed the one and only truth. The proselytizing fanatic strengthens his own faith by converting others. Price continues by explaining the plausibility structure, which is a social peer support group within which we find a shared belief compelling despite the skeptical jeering of those outside, whose criticisms are put on the shelf while we breathe the heady atmosphere of mutual affirmation. Evangelism is an attempt to increase the plausibility structure attendant to our belief so that we may never have any more occasion to doubt it. If I can get everybody to agree with me, then I must be right. They all agree. More votes. 1 million Mustang owners can't be wrong, can they? So let's sell some Mustangs. That is the ugly truth behind witnessing and evangelism. Its real motives are inherently selfish. They do it in order to suppress their own seething doubts. After all, this involves clinging to sheerly fanciful beliefs about talking snakes, genocidal storm gods, and resurrected zombies flying into space. You've got to crack a sweat to keep from admitting that such ideas are antiquated and no less than stupid. So here's a word of advice to those who do this, to those who have the gall to intrude into people's personal lives and disrespect their boundaries by peddling ancient mythology and wishful thinking. If you're going to impose, then we might as well take the opportunity to tell you this. You needn't worry about our salvation. Why is salvation a key component of Christianity? Because the notion of individual salvation was all the rage during the time of Christianity's inception. The long-revered Olympian gods of the Greek polis were diminished by a new sense of individualism that arose from the cosmopolitan and diverse climate of the Hellenistic age, following Alexander the Great's conquests over half the known world. Detribalized individuals began seeking personal salvation from both local and exotic gods and goddesses of their choosing, including Isis and Osiris, Dionysus, Salmoxis, Attis, Demeter and Persephone, etc. Several of these gods were thought to have gained victory over some great ordeal, including death itself. Devotees believed they could ritually reenact and share in that god's victory, imparting transformation, rebirth, salvation, and a blessed life after death. These mystery religions, so called because of their secretive initiation rites, flourished in the Greco-Roman world from which Christianity arose. Here are several key sources ranging from the 8th century BC to the 4th century CE. Happy is he among men upon earth who has seen these mysteries, but he who is uninitiate and who has no part in them never has lot of like good things once he is dead, down in the darkness and gloom. Thrice happy those among mortals who, having seen those mysteries, will go down to Hades. Only they can have true life there, for the rest all there is evil. They perform their ritual and persuade not only individuals but whole cities that expiations and atonements for sin may be made by sacrifices and amusements which fill a vacant hour, and are equally at the service of the living and the dead. The latter sort they call mysteries, and they redeem us from the pains of hell, but if we neglect them, no one knows what awaits us. Now you have died, and now you have been reborn, thrice blessed, on this day. Tell Persephone that Bacchus himself has redeemed you. The devotees of Zalmoxis claim to be immortal, states Herodotus, for they believe that they do not die, but that he who perishes goes to the god Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis entertained and feasted the chief among his countrymen, and taught them that neither he nor his guests, nor any of their descendants, should ever die, but that they should go to a place where they would live forever and have all good things. Be of good cheer, O initiates, for the god is saved, and we too shall have salvation for our woes. By the power of Isis, Lucius approached the frontiers of death, undergoing a kind of voluntary death and salvation through divine grace, whereby he returned, in a manner reborn, set once more upon the course of renewed life. By the way, I'm well aware that those last two sources are from the 2nd to 4th century CE, post-dating the New Testament. They concern the Greco-Roman mysteries of Isis and Osiris, which have a far older pedigree in the Egyptian cult of Osiris, which dates back to the 3rd millennium BC. Spare us the apologetic shtick. These ideas and their conceptual roots vastly predate your religion. Christianity shares these ideas precisely because it is a product of its time and place in history. Its concept of salvation is derived from a combination of both Jewish and Hellenistic themes, woven together by imaginative minds in a rich cultural melting pot from a bygone age. In short, it is a product of culture and history, of mankind's inevitable mixing and merging of theological and mythological ideas. Salvation in Christianity isn't real because it's demonstrably something we made up. Believe it all you want, but know that we know better. You needn't worry about our judgment either. This, too, is a confluence of ideas from ancient Near Eastern and Greek religious traditions. In ancient Egypt, the deceased stood trial before the throne of Osiris and a tribunal of 42 judges. Their hearts were weighed on a scale balanced against the feather of Maat, or truth and right living, and the scribal god Thoth recorded the results. If their hearts were found too heavy with sin, they were devoured by the crocodile-headed creature Ammit, and their bodies cast into an unquenchable lake of fire, where they suffered a second and final death. The Persian apocalypse would bring about a river of molten metal, where the righteous would walk unscathed while the wicked burned away. The evil anti-god Al-Rahman likewise meets his demise in this river of fire, just as Satan does in Revelation 20 verse 10. Among the Greeks, Tartarus was the underworld realm of torment and suffering, the same word used in 2 Peter 2 verse 4. According to Plato, he who has lived unjustly and impiously shall go to the house of vengeance and punishment, which is called Tartarus. In the myth of Plato elaborates, in the intermediate space there were judges seated, who commanded the just, after they had given judgment on them and had found their sentences in front of them, to ascend by the heavenly way on the right hand, and in like manner the unjust were bidden by them to descend by the lower way on the left hand. These also bore the symbols of their deeds, but fastened on their backs. In Virgil's Aeneid, the hero is terrified when he catches a glimpse of Tartarus. He beholds a swift river of red-hot flames, and a guardian clothed in a blood-wet dress, with the chilling sounds of groaning, lashing, and dragging chains. Greeks who had settled in southern Italy were probably witness to the rivers of fire that flowed from volcanoes in the region, sparking their imaginations as to what the underworld beheld. All told, the Bible's teachings on judgment and hell are just a mishmash of evolving and competing ideas from around the Mediterranean world, and its artificiality is laid bare by its numerous inconsistencies on the matter. The Old Testament begins by teaching outright mortalism, in which death is final, then speaks of a shadowy existence in Sheol as the final destination of both the righteous and the wicked, then of resurrection to either everlasting life or eternal contempt, depending on one's righteousness. The New Testament says that we are resurrected to a spiritual body without flesh and blood, then the opposite, and includes notions of an immediate paradisical life after death versus one in which we sleep prior to the resurrection. Hell ranges from a place of eternal fire and punishment to outright annihilation like that of ancient Egyptian belief. Confused yet? You should be, because the Bible is a convoluted mess of ancient authors making shit up about the afterlife. Again, believe it all you want, but we know better. And this leads to my final point. The second coming, at which point we're all supposed to receive our judgment, ain't coming. In Matthew 16:27 through 28, Jesus is depicted saying to his disciples, "For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." In other words, the Son of Man was supposed to return and hash out his judgment within the very lifetime of his own disciples. Well, they're dead now. Here we are some 2,000 years later, and he still ain't back. And no, that verse does not originally refer to the Transfiguration, some later dispensation, or whatever other cheap dodge apologists attempt to promulgate. He explicitly mentions coming in his Father's glory with his angels and rewarding each person according to what they have done, just as the final judgment of the dead in Revelation 20 states that the dead were judged according to what they had done. Verse 12. This is eschatological language, the stuff of Daniel 12 and Revelation 20 through 22. Matthew 16 refers to the eschaton, the second coming, the parousia. It was supposed to occur in the first century during the very lifetime of Jesus' own disciples thousands of years ago. It came, it went, it didn't happen, and it ain't gonna happen. Believe it all you want, but we know better. Salvation, hell, and divine judgment are all concepts that Christianity inherited from its time and place in ancient history, and its grand finale was supposed to occur a long time ago in a faraway place in ancient history.
So what we have here is a myth that has been literalized. But why?
People think, oh, why would anyone write a myth? But it's the language of the ancient world. So it's like asking, why do people write science fiction stories? Why did someone make The Matrix? Well, because it's a powerful story which transforms you when you come into contact with it. And it is made up of little motifs which have been taken from all over the place, put together in a new order. Well, that's what myth is in the ancient world. That's what the Jesus story is. Once literalist Christianity had been adopted by the Roman Empire, it was forced almost by its own logic to turn on the ancient mysteries. Because once you've got this idea that one man has come and is literally the Son of God, and you must literally believe in that history to be saved, well, you're almost duty-bound to enforce it. And the tolerance, spiritual tolerance, which marked out the ancient world, ended. And the pagan mysteries were eradicated, The Jews were attacked, and the other forms of Christianity, Gnostic Christianity, were also eradicated and their books burnt. And
modern-day Christianity's chance came when it was adopted by the despotic rule of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century Common Era. In 310 Common Era, the world was ruled by 4 joint Roman emperors, Constantine and Maxentius in the west, and Licinius and Maximinus Dio in the east. The official state religion was a form of paganism, with the most popular pagan deity being Sol Invictus, the sun god, also known as Mithra. The Christian religion existed and endured an uneasy existence, but it was not just one form of Christianity. As we now know, there were many varying forms, including the ancient mythical versions and the new post-70 Common Era literal version. Maxentius, Licinius and Maximinus Dio were all pagans and happy to promote the worship of Mithra. Constantine was also a pagan, but his mother, Helena, was a Christian who worshipped the god known as Jesus in one of its many forms. Post 310 Common Era, a 4-way civil war broke out. Constantine beat Maxentius in the west and Licinius beat Maximinus Dio in the east. In 324 Common Era, the 2 victors went to war for full control of the Roman Empire, and Constantine became the sole ruler of the known civilized world. Warming to his mother's religious views, he made Christianity the state religion in place of paganism. And in 325 Common Era, at the Council of Nicaea, he stated exactly what his version of Christianity was to be. And this is the birth of Catholic Christianity. And the pivotal moment in history when the understanding of the word Christianity was to morph and change forever. The only similarity between the Christianities of today and the original mythical versions is the name.
every culture in the ancient Mediterranean seems to have taken this perennial myth, which probably originated in Egypt, or could be so old it's Neolithic, and has made it its own, had its own version. And what we see happening is that the story of Joshua or Jesus becomes merged with this pagan story of a pagan dying and resurrecting God-man. So we know, for instance, in Alexandria, which is the New York of the ancient world, it's full of 25% of the population is Jewish. They're speaking Greek. Greek is the universal language, and we know that they're putting together Jewish mythology with pagan mythology, because we have lots of these texts which are called intertestamental texts, because they fall between the Old and the New Testament, which are clearly mythological texts which show a pagan Jewish crossover. If you free yourself from your preconditioning and you pick up the gospel story, you can clearly see that this is another one. These pagan myths have been merged with the mysteries of Moses and Joshua, which told the story of going to the Promised Land, which was a Gnostic initiatory myth for the Jews, which is then being mixed with this pagan story.
In the 325 Common Era Christian world, people's very being depended on them physically demonstrating their belief in God and Jesus. Mere lip service would not suffice. Their children's survival in this world was dependent on how well they, as parents, indoctrinated their children with belief in God and Jesus. If their children did not grow into adulthood with unquestioning belief in God and Jesus, they simply would not make it into adulthood.
The book Caesar's Messiah shows that the Gospels were written by a family of Roman Caesars called the Flavians. They created the Gospels as a political tool. They wanted to create a different version of Messianic Judaism. They had fought against a Messianic movement in Judea that was obviously militaristic and violently opposed to Roman rule. So the Gospels were created to replace that version of Messianic Judaism. The reason that the Romans wanted to create their own Savior Messiah is because they wanted to have a pacifistic Christ. The Christ that they were fighting against was a military Messiah. The storyline of Jesus is fiction. It was based upon a military campaign of a Roman Caesar named Titus Flavius. The reason that people have not recognized that the character Jesus Christ is fiction is simply because they haven't understood the genre that the Gospels were written in. The Gospels are, in fact, a Roman mockery of a kind of literature that the Jews produced in the first century. And this type of literature is referred to as typology. Typology is simply basing one character upon another, and it is found throughout Hebraic literature in the Old Testament to link one prophet to another prophet. At the very first page of the book of Matthew, the author has created a primer, a small example of the typology that's going to extend throughout all of the works. And what Matthew has done is he has taken stories from the Old Testament and placed them into his story of the pre-ministry of Jesus. He has taken names, locations, and concepts from the Old Testament, and he has woven them into his story about Jesus Christ. And he has placed them in the same sequence, so that when you compare one story to the other, the Old Testament with the New Testament, you can see that Moses was connected very directly to the character that Matthew is writing about, Jesus Christ. The reason that Moses was chosen as the archetype of Jesus is because he was the first savior of Israel. And so by connecting him directly to that particular Hebraic prophet, you show that Jesus Christ is also a savior of Israel. And what's interesting is that this shows that the character of Jesus Christ is fiction. The events in his life are not original historical episodes. They were simply taken from another book. Now, the same thing is true about the entire rest of Jesus' ministry. It is all taken from another book. So I'm going to present an outline, an abbreviated version of what I have named the Flavian signature in the Gospels. And this is essentially the typologic connections between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus Flavius. Now, these connections occur on the side of Jesus Christ. Of course, we find them in the Gospels. The military campaign of Titus Flavius was written by his historian Flavius Josephus. And so I will be showing these connections between the Gospels and the Flavian history of the military campaign. Get the online versions of both the Gospels and of Whiston's translation of Josephus so that you can actually go step by step. You can repeat every single connection that I am making here, and you will be able to see for yourself this amazing relationship between Josephus and the Gospel. And I am confident that you'll recognize that this was obviously deliberate. And this will become particularly clear when I get to certain areas in the Gospels that have what I call almost a virtual literary barcode, so that you can see that these very unusual events are occurring in both stories, and they're occurring in the same sequence. It begins at the same location for both of these individuals, the Sea of Galilee. At the Sea of Galilee, Jesus comes and tells his disciples that from now on, if you follow me, you will catch men. Now, this is mirrored by the experience that Titus Flavius has, where he comes to the Sea of Galilee. His men go out into the sea to attempt to destroy the Jews who are in their fishing boats. The boats are sunk. The Jews attempt to swim to safety, and the Romans catch them like fish. The typology that Matthew had used ends directly before this episode in Matthew. You can see that, you have the typology that links Jesus to Moses, and then just a few lines later, suddenly here you have this odd parallel between Jesus and Titus. And this is really quite strange that given that the beginning of Matthew is all of this typology, and this is something that scholars do not dispute, that the connection between Jesus and Moses was deliberately created. But here you have a parallel that's just as good as the ones we saw in the story between Jesus and Moses, and yet no one has ever asked this obvious question. It's the same location, it's at the beginning of the ministries of both of these individuals, and you do have this very odd parallel concept of fishing for men. So, having made this simple step of just asking the question, is it possible that these events were deliberately wired together as we had seen occurred in the events that led directly up to it? Just asking that simple question is all anyone needs to do to enter into the most profound archaeologic discovery in Western civilization. That simple step takes us right into the Flavian signature. Once you start to recognize and believe that these stories, the story of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus Flavius, once you recognize that they were wired together, you can read in a different way. You can read with that strong bias, and these parallels will start to pop out. Now, where does the bias come from? As we go through this, you'll see that there are many parallels which are absolutely crystal clear, and they form a kind of foundation from which everything else can be seen. So as I go through it, I'll point out to you the first parallel, and this is something that frankly just baffles me, is that the journeys are the same. And I'm going to describe it now so we won't have to go into it in too much detail later on. But the fact is, you start out in Galilee, at the Sea of Galilee. You then go out into the Galilean countryside. Then at a certain point, Jesus declares that he's going to go on to Jerusalem. He takes the journey, but when he gets to the city, he doesn't go directly in. He stays outside the city for a while. He then has a triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, and then the story of Jesus takes you outside of the city again for the crucifixion. Well, this is the exact journey that Titus takes. Now, this in and of itself is perhaps not overwhelmingly strong evidence that the two stories were deliberately connected, but it is suspicious. It rises to the level of suspicion and curiosity. Why are they exactly the same? I mean, for example, why does Jesus wait for a period of time before he goes into Jerusalem? What's the point of that? When you look at the storyline of Jesus' ministry, it is mysterious. I mean, why does he go to these particular places in this sequence? Why does he stop? But once you start to question, was this done because the author is wiring Jesus directly into the story of Titus, then you start to have this bias that I talked about. So that's the first point I want to make, is that the actual locations are exactly the same. And this, of course, mirrors the typology that I talked about previously. The typology that connected Jesus to Moses had the same physical journey. So that this is why it is so interesting that Jesus and Titus have the same physical journey, and it requires of an alert reader. It isn't really just a supposition on my part. I think it's a requirement of every scholar and every person that wants to know the truth about the Gospels, is to ask the question: was the geography, was the journey created to mirror that of Titus Flavius's? All right, so I'm going to just go through some of the stories that are parallel, that were wired. I'm not going to go into any detail, but I'm just going to describe them so that people can, at their leisure, read them carefully and make a connection. You then have a strange story in both Josephus's tale of Titus's military campaign and the Gospels, where you have to keep holy the Sabbath by restoring a right hand. Then you have the story of the demon of Gadara. And just immediately before that, you have a tale of John who's possessed by a demon. As you go through the story of the of demons of Gadara, you'll see that it is an exact parallel to the battle of Gadara that Titus had, where you even have you can actually lay what happens to the herd, where they rushed to, how they drowned. The stories are very, very similar, and in fact, the parallels between the tales have been covered by many scholars. After Gadara, you have the identification of the Christ. Happens in both stories at the same place. Following the identification of the Christ, you have descriptions of binding and loosening. Little stories which describe both binding and loosening. And these are very, very important parallels and have been seen by other scholars, but they have not bothered to place them into the sequence. After the time in the Galilean countryside, you now have a point of decision where Titus decides to go on to Jerusalem, and he sends his troops ahead of him, a certain group of them, to meet him there. Jesus has the exact same event. He decides suddenly that he has to go on to Jerusalem, and the Gospels say he sends his messengers ahead. The Good Samaritan is just a fascinating piece of typology. The story in the Gospels describes someone who's he's on the road to Samaria. He's grabbed by a group of robbers. They steal his mule. They beat him up. And at this point in the campaign of Titus Flavius, he appears with the 12th Legion. And Josephus recounts how well they have been refurbished. The 12th Legion was attacked by a group of Jewish rebels on the road. They stole their mules and stripped them of their clothes and goods. Titus, who is described as coming through Samaria, has refurbished the legion and now is walking with them to Jerusalem. So Titus, the story of the Good Samaritan, which there have been so many things written about as to what it means and what exactly Jesus is talking about, is actually just a representation of Titus refurbishing a legion that had had its mule stolen from it, and then going forward to wage war against the Jews. Now you get outside Jerusalem. Both of these individuals come out to outside Jerusalem. And they pause. Now, in Titus's case, it's because he needs to organize his triumphant entrance into the city. And the same is true in Jesus, though we don't exactly know why he can't just walk in at this particular point, but he doesn't. He stays outside and he has these events. And when you compare the events between Jesus and Titus as they are outside of Jerusalem, you can really start to see some of the connections becoming very, very clear. Jesus talks about knocking on the door. He talks about the authors of the Gospels talk about how the Jews are trying to lay traps for him. They talk about the Jews increasing in number, surrounding Jesus. I mean, these are all obviously, related to the campaign that Titus is waging. And you can see this when you actually put the experiences right next to each other. That Jesus and Titus are both essentially having these battles with Jews directly outside of Jerusalem. And when you compare them in their sequence, you can see that this event of Jesus, the events that occurred to him as he was outside Jerusalem, are definitely all simply were based upon what is happening to Titus as his military campaign goes forward. I wanted to go through a few of the parallels in a little more depth because what I'm presenting here is a barcode. In other words, this is a connection between Titus's military campaign and Jesus's ministry that is so direct and so transparent that it's really indisputable. There really isn't any way that this connection that I'm going to show you could have been accidentally created. It wasn't just the people writing the Gospels who were looking for interesting stories to put into their character of Jesus. This is clearly proof. These events, when you lay them on top of one another and you compare, the parallels, are absolutely clear evidence that Jesus is a fictional character whose story is based upon Titus Flavius. So the first of these parallels I call the woe-saying Jesus. Now, in both Josephus and the Gospels, you have a character called Jesus who goes into a long litany of woes, uses the word woe over and over again. The character in Josephus has just so many connections to the character in the Gospels that many, many scholars have written about them. If you look in the internet, you'll see this, the woe-saying Jesus in Josephus is, by hundreds of people, is claimed to have been based upon the character in the Gospels. What they haven't recognized is that when you look at the two storylines, that the woe-saying Jesus appears at the same place in both tales. The character in Josephus, who is a woe-saying Jesus, is an obvious representation of the character in the Gospels. Okay. He enters Jerusalem during a pilgrimage festival. He delivers a woe oracle against Jerusalem. He is seized by the leading citizens. Both Jesuses are beaten and later scourged. Neither one of them answers a direct question during the interrogation. They are both taken to the Roman procurator. They're called madmen, and the word is the same. It's a special Greek word. Both of them are referred to as madmen using this word. Both Jesuses prophesy their own death, and then both of them die. So you can see that this is very suspicious that there are all these direct connections between the character in Josephus, who also has the name of Jesus. But when you place this event in the overall storyline, then it really becomes dramatic. Then it becomes very, very difficult to say, wait a second, how could this possibly be? This is obviously typology. Some author is creating this character, Jesus Christ, in the gospel, and is using characters from Josephus to build him up. Following that event, you have a very distinct connection between the so-called innocents being beaten worse than the guilty. Very unusual concept, and in both cases it occurs immediately following the woe-saying Jesus. Here we have a parallel that is simply impossible to ignore. It is so direct, and when it is placed in sequence, it becomes part of what I'm referring to as the barcode. And I'm actually going to read just a few lines so that people can hear with their ears exactly how profound these similarities are. Josephus wrote that the sedition had been divided into 3 factions, was now reduced to 2. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus is asked if he came to bring peace on earth. And he states, not at all, rather division. From now on, 5 in one house will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. So notice that Jesus did not come to bring peace like Titus. The division in both cases is noted, and of course the 3 to 2. this parallel is very unusual. Very, very complex, very unusual. All of these concepts swirling around, all of these different ideas, war, division, 3 for 2. And yet, when you place it in context, it becomes even more vivid, stronger. Now, a trivial parallel, but a very perfect one. Jesus predicts that a fruit tree should be cut down if it doesn't bear good fruit. And Titus orders all of the fruit trees between the Roman camp and the city walls cut down. Jesus predicts that a fruit tree will be cut down. Titus orders the fruit tree to be cut down. You have a story where the Roman siege apparatus has given the Jews only a very narrow door. And Josephus then records the points of a compass that describe how this door has been shut. Jesus has a story that has these exact concepts. You have trivial parallels now about Jesus wondering, what is the best way to build a tower? But then if you look into Josephus, you'll see that, in fact, Titus is looking at that exact point for the best place to build a tower. Now, Jesus mentions the sending of a delegation to find peace. Titus sends a delegation to find peace. Okay, now we come to really the most interesting of all of the parallels in the Gospels. It's fascinating, just from the perspective of literary analysis, of how they actually were able to achieve this. Very innocuously in the Gospels, you have the triumphant entrance of Jesus. The people cry out, the Son is come. And then you have this bizarre story where Jesus is told to make these people quiet down. And he says, oh, no, if they were quiet, that the stones themselves would cry out. And then Jesus goes on and states that something has been blackened from your eyes, hidden from you, so you can't see it. It doesn't really make a lot of theological sense, but when you place that story in context with Josephus, it just comes to life. Because it is at this point that Josephus makes his famous mistake. Titus has his entrance into the city at this point. He fires a stone from a catapult, and it goes right into the city. The Jews have a watchman who cries out when he sees the stone coming. But Josephus wrote that the watchman didn't say, a stone is coming. Josephus made a mistake, supposedly. He wrote, the watchman cried out, the Son cometh. So this, in context, again, is amazing. Many people have tried different ways to get around Josephus's mistake. In fact, a lot of them. And that's one of the reasons why you need to use the Whiston translation, because it's very, very literal. Many modern translators simply just mistranslate it. They say, they have the watchman stating, the stone is coming. But what Josephus wrote was, the Son cometh. And then in the next line, Josephus actually has the stone crying out. And Whiston very faithfully translates, very precisely. That's why I recommend using Whiston, because he's so literal. You can see it actually in the text. The stone cries out. This is followed then by a description of the Romans being aware that the Jews can see the stone, and so they blacken it. They hide it from their eyes. When you place these concepts on top of one another and next to one another, it is absolutely transparent. This is directly wiring one story into the other. There is no way, absolutely no way, that Josephus would make the only real error in grammar he makes is an entire book at the exact point in the storyline that the Son cometh in the Gospels. This is beyond impossible. This did not happen. These stories are wired for sound. And now we can actually prove it. We can go into real proof, because following the Son cometh, we now have parallels which are not conceptual, but they are the same thing. Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall. Titus encircles Jerusalem with a wall. There is no ambiguity here at all. This is literally the same thing, and yet it is occurring at exactly the correct point in time. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus at this point drives out the thieves from the area in front of the temple. This famous story of Jesus driving out the polluters of the temple area. At this point in the storyline in Josephus, Titus gets control of the area in front of the temple. And he refers to the group that he's driving out with the same Greek word, which indicates that they are robbers or thieves, the same word that Jesus used to describe them. Now we're going to come to the final point in what I call the barcode. Jesus predicts that the abomination of desolation, which is an event that Daniel predicted, actually, will come to pass. And Josephus records that, in fact, the abomination of desolation occurred at this exact point. So when you then look back at this collection of events, when you go to the fruit tree, when you look at the Son cometh, when you then see the stone crying out, and the things which cannot be disputed, the encircling of the wall, the encircling of the city with the wall, the driving of the thieves and robbers away from the area directly in front of the temple, and then the abomination of desolation. It's simply impossible. These are very, very unique concepts. There are not a dozen books that even describe these concepts. The abomination of desolation, the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall. These are very, very unusual concepts. They could not occur in the same sequence accidentally. This is really important for our culture, to understand where Christianity came from. And this is direct evidence. You can actually walk this path and come to this conclusion. You can know that Christianity was an invention of the Romans. It was done to pacify their subjects. And this is important because it gives us a different way of understanding government, how government operates, the tools that government uses, the purpose that government has for the various propaganda apparatus. I think it's a requirement of alert citizens to know how the Gospels were written, why they were written, who produced them, what was the purpose and back of all this. This is good citizenry. Everyone should be involved in this. Everyone should be looking at this, reading it, and coming and recognizing that this was where the Gospels originated. The Gospels came from the Flavian Imperial court. All right, so I'm not going to go into the final parallels because you can simply buy the book if you want to gain insights into these, but you will see that in both Josephus and in the Gospels you have a human Passover lamb, a Last Supper, where the Son of Mary becomes a human Passover lamb. You have a crucifixion of a group of three, where one survives, and that Joseph of Arimathea, or in Josephus' story, Joseph bar Arimathea, takes them down from the cross. And then the conclusion of the Gospels is the prophecy that Jesus makes concerning Simon and John, that Simon will be taken where he doesn't want to go, bound and given to death to glorify God, and John will be spared. At the conclusion of Josephus, the rebel leaders, Simon and John, are captured. John is given perpetual imprisonment, and Simon's experience is an exact parallel an exact fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus gave. So, that is the Flavian signature.
Is the story of Jesus remembered history or a religious fable? When many of the other arguments for a historical Jesus fall over, you will often hear the argument, well, mainstream historians say there was a Jesus, so that must settle it. There must have been a Jesus. It is also the case that many atheists, though convinced that there's no God, will also say, well, I think there was a Jesus. So I want to take a few minutes to convince you that mainstream historians and atheists possibly influenced by them are actually wrong. Now let's first of all clarify just who it is we are talking about. We are not speaking of any old character of the first century Galilee who had the name Jesus. There were lots of those, literally thousands, because Yeshua or Yehoshua was one of the most common Jewish names of the time. We are speaking of a character who was supposedly the source and inspiration for the fantastical tales that fill the pages of the New Testament. Yes, I am allowing for the fact that embellishment and exaggeration could have been applied to an original, simple and genuine tale, that the man behind the legend may have been a rather ordinary character. But of course, it could not have been too ordinary, or he would not have stood out from the thousands of others who shared his name. Let me introduce you to one such figure, one favoured by mainstream historians such as Bar Ehrman and others. For them, the real Jesus was a prophet in the style of earlier Jewish prophets, who had a following for his particular brand of end-time doom and gloom. Because he was unexpectedly executed, his despairing followers reinvented him as a risen Messiah or Christ. All else in the New Testament is embellishment and invention. So here we have a rationalised, acceptable Jesus, who doesn't suspend the laws of the universe. But he is only one of hundreds of rationalised Jesuses. You may have a favourite of your own, a radical rabbi, a Jewish nationalist, a healer, a teacher. You name it. They are all equally valid and all equally speculative, floating free of any factual foundation. Now, why do I say these various alternative Jesuses are speculations? Because not one of them is based on hard, verifiable evidence from non-biblical sources. Any one of them is possibly true, but is any one of them even probably true? Each is derived from a selective reading of the gospel stories. Each is built up from certain passages, discounting all the rest as pious fabrication. That's why the so-called mainstream historians cut the ground from beneath each other. What is the pious fabrication to one is the residual element of a genuine historical episode to another. Yet not one part of the story is immune from being pious fiction to some and having the ring of truth to others. But there is an alternative to this free-for-all, join the dots and make your own Jesus approach. And that is to recognise that these speculations are no better than seeing the signs of the zodiac in the night sky. In reality, there is no figure there, whether a sign of the zodiac or a Jesus of Nazareth. Now, Christianity makes a claim that a truly fabulous character started the movement with his teachings and miracles, climaxing in his resurrection appearances after death. But can rational minds really claim that some minor character below the visible event horizon of history was either necessary or useful to a story that is acknowledged to be, in all salient aspects, fabricated from religious literature? The simplest, parsimonious explanation is that no human Jesus ever existed. Now, although historians like Bar Ehrman think that it required the memory of a dead holy man to get the first Christians dreaming up a resurrected Messiah. In truth, merely the idea of a dead holy man works just as well. And we can be absolutely certain it was just the idea of a dead holy man, because the one thing we can say about the Gospels is that they were not written by simple, illiterate, Aramaic-speaking fishermen and peasants who knew Jesus, but were written decades later by literate, educated writers who wrote in Greek and were, incidentally, rather hazy about the Jewish landscape. We are not dealing with eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers had either to be told the story or had to read their inspiration elsewhere. And what could they have read in the holy books of the Jews, translated into Greek centuries earlier? They would have read of healing and resurrection miracles, tales of food multiplication, of divine judgments, of wise prophets in special communication with God, who wander about making pleasing and sometimes enigmatic wisdom statements. They would have read of a suffering servant who takes on the sins of the world, of babies born by divine intervention. In other words, they would have read all the core elements in order to write an inspiring story of a Jewish saviour God-man, a Jesus Christ. All good stuff, of course, for a religious fable. But it isn't history, it isn't true, it's more astounding rubbish.
Interesting. So not only is the New Testament fabricated and created so that they can create their own mythology and their own Jesus and fulfill their own prophecies spoken about within the Old Testament, but even the Jesus itself is created, and more than likely created by Flavius. Oh wait, there's more.
In Matthew chapter 27, verse 34, while Jesus is hanging on the cross, he is given wine mixed with gall to drink. However, in a sizable amount of manuscripts, he is not given wine, but vinegar mixed with gall to drink. Similar sour-tasting fluids, but not the same type of drink, and again, not the result of some simple spelling error. The change might have been made by some scribes from wine to vinegar to best fit an Old Testament prophecy in Psalms. They poisoned my food with gall and gave me vinegar to quench my thirst. In another example, although most of us are more familiar with the conflict between David and Goliath, 2 Samuel also discusses a second but very similar battle, rendered into modern English Bibles as, in another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan son of Jar, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. In some Bibles, you might see a little subscript citation that reads, Hebrew does not have the brother of. As it turns out, the actual translation of 2 Samuel based on the Hebrew should read like this, Elhanan son of Jar the Bethlehemite killed Goliath the Gittite. The words the brother of was straight up added into the English text much later. This change originates in the King James Bible of 1611, where a scribe inserted the three words to fix or retcon the perceived contradiction of the giant warrior Goliath being killed twice in Samuel by two different people, once by David and then again by Elhanan. One last change that I thought was really interesting is in Mark chapter 6 verse 3. In the passage, people from Jesus' own town, upon listening to his teachings, are astonished and ask, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James?" This actually is the only passage in the entire New Testament in which Jesus is referred to as a carpenter. The Greek word used is tekton. The real meaning of this word is more nondescript than carpenter. It essentially refers to anyone who makes things with his hands, which could include the profession of being a carpenter, but a more accurate translation could be something like construction worker or day laborer. A tekton would more likely be building fences and yokes, and even houses, not fancy modern tables or cabinets. Nonetheless, there are some versions of Mark chapter 6 verse 3 that do not say Jesus was a carpenter, but instead say he was the son of a carpenter. The earliest manuscript of Mark, P45, reads like this, "Is this not the son of a carpenter?" It's not exactly clear why a change was made here, or even which one was the original. It should be noted that a tekton was a very low-class profession, and some, namely Romans and other pagans, looked at it with disgust. We do know that some early Christians in the first few centuries, like Origen, disliked the claim that Jesus was a carpenter and stated that in none of the Gospels current in the churches is Jesus himself even described as being a carpenter. Scribes might have changed Jesus from being a carpenter to the mere son of a carpenter to make Jesus' origins and profession prior to his teachings slightly more noble and respectable in the eyes of pagans. Books removed. There's been entire books removed from the Bible. What? Yeah, the 66 or 73 or 80 books, depending on what sect of Christianity you belong to, of the Old and New Testaments that constitute our modern English Bibles have not always been consistent throughout history. Whenever archaeologists uncover older manuscripts and copies of the biblical books like Genesis or Exodus or the Gospels, which allow us to identify these textual changes that have occurred over time, they are often found in caches amongst copies of dozens, if not hundreds, of other books that are not found in our modern Bibles. When the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of our oldest copies of the books of the Old Testament, were discovered by chance in a remote desert cave in what was then Jordan, it was somewhat uncomfortable to find that intermixed with these documents were books that no average Christian or Jew in the modern day had ever even seen before. The Book of Noah, the Book of Giants, the Book of Enoch, the Letter of Jeremiah, the Book of Tobit, the Wisdom of Sirach. All of these are books that are omitted by the canon of most sects of Judaism and Christianity today, but they appear to have been deemed just as important to the ancient Jews as canonical texts like Genesis, Samuel, and Isaiah. Furthermore, several caches of New Testament texts have been found containing both canonical and non-canonical texts. The Nag Hammadi Library was discovered by an Egyptian peasant in the 1940s and 50s. An early Christian monk, almost 2,000 years ago, had buried dozens of books and manuscripts in a tomb, in an ancient graveyard, perhaps fearing they would be destroyed. And there they were left, forgotten and buried for centuries. These Christian texts are very, very fascinating, as they date to about the same time as our earliest copies of the Gospels and other New Testament texts, but provide us a very different view of Christianity. The early Christians who wrote and believed these books were part of an early sect called the Gnostics. The Gnostics differed from other Christians in many respects, one of them being that they believed the God of the New Testament and Old Testament were two different beings, the Old Testament God being evil and cruel. They were often denounced as heretics by the leaders of rival Christian sects, who eventually won by proclaiming the Gnostic books were heresy, and burned and destroyed most of them as a result. We can only picture the bitterness of the unknown Gnostic monk who must have hid the Nag Hammadi text hoping they would be spared the great cleansing that befell most of these heretical books. He might have crossed his fingers, wishing that his treasured beliefs would survive into the uncertain future. Which, well, he succeeded, and they did survive. Among these texts were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Wisdom of Jesus Christ, the Gnosis of the Invisible God, and perhaps most famous, the Gospel of Judas. All of them give us a look into what some early Christians believed, and took as gospel, pun entirely intended, before a clear canon was developed. The Gospel of Judas is a fascinating read if you ever get the chance. The book essentially retells the typical story found in our modern canonical Gospels, but attempts to recontextualize the relationship between Judas and Jesus in a different light. It alleges that Judas did not betray Jesus, but was in fact his most adherent and intelligent follower. In the famous Last Supper scene, Jesus is disappointed at the ignorance of his own disciples. They do not understand who he is or what his mission is. Judas alone out of them tells Jesus that, "I know who you are and where you come from. You are from the mortal realm of Barbelo." This intrigues Jesus, and he privately speaks with this rogue disciple. He convinces Judas that in order to complete his heavenly mission, he must shed his bodily form and ascend to the stars. According to the Gospel, Judas was in truth not betraying Jesus, but was following his direct but secret orders when he gave him up for crucifixion. Some might consider the Gospel of Judas closer to ancient DeviantArt fanfiction, but such alternative narratives and books are common and illustrate to us that there were, and still are, hundreds of books that did not end up in our modern English Bibles, but were once read and believed by early Christians and Jews around the same time as the texts that did end up in our modern English Bibles. Some of these believers dying over the authenticity of their own texts at the swords of other believers who considered them to be heretics. The decision of which books ended up as canon and which were heretical was very much something that was based off of who in the early church had the largest political power and influence at that time. The reason why the book of Acts is in your Bible and the Gospel of Judas is not was something decided either on the battlefield or by popular vote through religious councils like the Council of Rome, Antioch, Nicaea, Hippo, Carthage, and Florence. Perhaps if the outcomes of battles or votes came out differently, we'd have 67 or 103 or 230 books in our Bibles. It's why Catholics have 73 books in their Bibles while other denominations have 66. Sects and fractures within Christianity and Judaism are nothing new, and they've existed and have continued to exist since the religions began thousands of years ago. In conclusion, the Bible has been changed throughout history. Anyone who has taken the time to research the evidence with an open mind, regardless of if they are Christian or Jewish or Gnostic, has acknowledged this. The Bible is not some unaltered, changeless text that has remained exactly how it is over thousands of years, but has been changed, altered, added to, and subtracted for millennia ever since the texts were first written by the quills of their dozens of unknown authors. These changes have been made by hundreds of nameless scribes for reasons that were politically and theologically motivated. We should have enough respect for the Bible to admit this.
It's a quirk of history that we're not here discussing whether there was and wasn't a real Mithras, because very nearly Mithraism, which is a Persian cult, which is again a foreign cult to the Roman Empire, became the dominant cult across the whole of the ancient world under the Romans. They tried that. They tried numbers of, they didn't go straight to Christianity, they tried numbers of things which didn't gel, didn't work. Each emperor would come across with their own thing. And this is partly how all of this began to, the traditional history fell to bits, was that after the Reformation, Protestant scholars were looking at the Catholic Church, which they just split from, and going, hang on, all of these rites and rituals and the Pope, and this is all pagan. And so it started with the Reformation, and you then had, for the first time, scholars actually examining the texts, free to do it, and examining the rituals. For them, they were looking for the real Jesus, and were peeling away what they thought were accretions to find the real man. All that's happened is that Peter, Gandhi, and I, and other scholars have carried on that tradition. I mean, Albert Schweitzer, he's a great example, and gone right down and gone, do you know what? You keep going and there's no one underneath this. Once I got over the shock of having, being part of the most famous man who ever lived didn't. Once you got your head around that, what I found was that there was this incredible depth of mystical wisdom available for me through the Western tradition, which I hadn't been able to see before. And that, the paradox is that if there is a man underneath it, then he is probably not the man that you think or I think. Because everyone's got a different Jesus, haven't they? Jews have a Rabbi Jesus, Hindu think he's an avatar, a lot of people think he's a Buddha figure, especially Buddhists. It's like everyone, the Muslims think he's a prophet like Muhammad, maybe not quite as good. It's like everyone's got their own Jesus.
The Bible you might find placed in a dirty motel nightstand is a Gideon's Bible, named after a Christian organization that tries to distribute as many copies of this Bible as possible across the world. Now, these Bibles are often in the ESV or English Standard Version, published in 2001. They have been rendered into modern English to best suit a 21st century audience. The ESV is itself a translation of the Revised Standard Version of 1952, which is itself a revision of the American Standard Version of 1901, which is a translation of the English Revised Version of the late 1800s, which is finally a revision of the King James Version published in 1611. The King James Version of the Bible is the granddaddy to pretty much all later English translations. Staying with me so far? So you might be noticing that there is a huge gap between 1611 and 33 AD, when Jesus supposedly died. Where exactly did the King James Bible come from? Well, the King James used several sources for its translation. For the Old Testament, it used a translation into English of the Greek Masoretic texts, or MT, primarily copied, edited, and distributed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes, between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. The oldest surviving copy of one of these texts dated to around the 9th century. But then again, the 7th and 10th centuries are 700 to 1000 years away from Jesus. Where did these come from? Well, these Masoretic texts are themselves copies based off of a now lost older text and an older one still, until we finally reach the original Old Testament of the Bible, which has been lost to time. A similar thing can be done with the New Testament, where copies of copies of copies, some lost, some surviving, can trace us back to the text written shortly after the time of Jesus. In any case, what you begin to find is that the foundations of our modern Bibles are in truth based off of only a few lines of these copies of the originals. And when you zoom out, there's an entire web of different cousin Bible lines, working parallel to the ones our modern Bibles have used, like the MT line or the Vulgate line, that can be mapped out like a family tree, all of them being able to trace back to the original text created thousands of years ago. For instance, we have the Vulgate, a Latin version of the Bible used in Catholic churches, which shares a common origin text with the MT, but contains unmistakable differences. Archaeology has been of crucial importance to biblical scholarship. For hundreds of years, archaeologists have been uncovering older versions of the Bible, buried in ancient houses or in caves dated all the way back to the 1st century AD and BC. For instance, we have the Codex Venaticus, or B, written in Greek sometime around the 300s AD, and kept in the Vatican Library since at least the 15th century. It is one of the oldest copies of the Bible in its recognizable form. Codex Sinaiticus, written around 330 to 360 AD, is held today in the British Library in London. We have fragmentary documents of Aquila of Sinope's translation of the Bible, written in the 2nd century. Even older copies of individual books as opposed to complete Bibles can be found even further back. Papyrus 66, discovered in Egypt and dated to around 200 AD, is a near-complete codex of the Gospel of John. The famous Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient manuscripts, provide us some of the oldest and extensive copies of the Old Testament. Although all these documents and manuscripts are mere copies of originals, they nonetheless are valuable to us. Scholars have uncovered literally hundreds of different copies of texts from the Bible, and what they have discovered about these texts is that, when compared with one another, say Papyrus 75 with Codex Venaticus, or the MT with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the texts generally read the same, if not near exactly in most places. But in others, they vary. They can be different in minor and even major ways. Another example of a scribal mistake can be seen in Luke chapter 12, verse 8 and 9, which typically reads, "Whoever confesses me before humans, the Son of Man will confess before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before humans will deny before the angels of God." However, in our oldest papyrus manuscript of this passage, all of verse 9 is left off. As biblical scholar Bart Ehrman says, it is not difficult to see how the mistake was made. The scribe copied the words before the angels of God in verse 8, and when his eye returned to the page, he picked up the same words in verse 9, and assumed those were the words he just copied. And so he proceeded to copy verse 10, leaving out verse 9 altogether. You can find hundreds of similar errors and mistakes like these throughout the texts that survive to us today. But other changes, as we will discuss in a second, appear to have not been mere mistakes, but intentional and motivated alterations to the text. In some versions, verses, words, or entire passages have been added, subtracted, or changed beyond recognition. Scholars, both Christian, Jewish, agnostic, and atheist, often agree and recognize the evidence for such intentional changes. There are also other examples where the Greek text has said one thing, but later translators rendering the text into a different language have simply made their own versions of what the text should say to solve perceived contradictions. Other additions are just that, wholly new additions that weren't part of the text at all. Goliath's height. The battle between the young King David and the giant Philistine Goliath in the Old Testament book of Samuel is well known and perhaps needs no introduction. The encounter is often depicted in cartoons and children's books, a tiny boy up against a colossus. The giant, as described in the English Bibles used in churches today in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4, reads like this: "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span." This height would by modern estimates be a little less than 10 feet tall, towering over the tallest recorded man ever, Robert Wadlow. As stated before, this height originates in the Masoretic text, or MT, written around the late 1st millennium AD. However, all the oldest copies of this book and verse, such as the Septuagint, and notably the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st century BC, render Goliath's height as a much shorter 4 cubits in a span, or 6 feet 9 inches, a more historically plausible and realistic height when compared to the other reading. This shorter Goliath is also confirmed by other historical non-biblical texts, such as the writings of the historian Josephus in the 1st century AD. It seems like the older 4 cubits in a span reading was the original text of Samuel, as opposed to the 6 cubits in a span reading. Christian scholar and Professor J. Daniel Hayes agrees with this assessment and argues for reducing Goliath's height in modern Bibles. The motivation for this change seems likely to have been that of a tall tale, literally in this case. Later scribes perhaps wanting to make David's achievement of slaying a formidable opponent even more impressive, just as a fisherman is prone to exaggerate the length of his catch in retellings of his story. Over time, Goliath went from an abnormally, but yet plausible height to a monster out of mythology and legend. Women omitted. It may be a surprise to learn that one of the major divisions in early Christianity was that of the role of women in the church. We know from historical records and Christian writings that certain sects believed women should have a large involvement in the church, while other sects were more sexist, often limiting women's rights and capabilities within the confines of the religion, for instance preventing women to read or teach. Scribes belonging to these two sects clashed sometimes over the translations of certain verses. For example, in Romans 16, Paul lists several names and greetings to fellow Christians of the day. In verse 7 he writes, "Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me." Paul names Andronicus, a male name, and Junia, a female name, suggesting they are husband and wife to one another as foremost among the apostles. It is notable as it outright states women can become apostles, and notably church leaders. This would support the pro-women sects. Some later translators, however, rendered Junia as Junias, a masculine name, and Andronicus no longer as her husband, but as a traveling companion. This is strange, as although Junia was a very common name for a woman back in those days, there is absolutely no evidence in the ancient world for the name as Junias, for a dude's name. It is very clear Paul was referring to a woman in this text and acknowledging her as an apostle, but still to this day some Bibles continue to refer to Junia as a man rather than a woman. Some other manuscripts have tried to circumvent this possible pro-women leanings in other ways, rendering "Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me," as "Salute Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, and also greet my fellow prisoners who are foremost among the apostles." In this version, a woman is again no longer an apostle, but merely a relative of Paul, changing the whole meaning of the text. There are dozens of other minor changes just like these that seem to have been made to reduce the role of women in the early Christian church. Prominent women become in some versions the wives of prominent men. Instances where the wife was named before the husband were reversed in others, Priscilla and Aquila to Aquila and Priscilla. Minor and petty changes many of these may be, they reflect a movement by scribes to reduce or increase the role of women in the early church, and illustrate a textual battle of sorts, and we can still see this in the early copies of the Bible that survive to us today. Forgiveness on the cross. The Gospel of Luke recounts Jesus' crucifixion in Jerusalem. "And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with criminals, on his right and on the other on his left. And Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing.'" Jesus' prayer, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing," is often seen as an illustration of Jesus' compassion and kindness towards those who are killing him, displaying forgiveness where most would seek vengeance. It's a very nice quote, and personally one of my favorites. However, this line curiously is missing in some of the older manuscripts of Luke. The earliest Greek copy, Papyrus P75, dated to about 200 AD, as well as a few other later texts, completely lacks the prayer of forgiveness, reading like this: "When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals on his right, the other on his left. They divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him." But the prayer exists in other copies, such as the Codex Sinaiticus. So this raises the question, was the prayer originally in the Gospel and then removed in some versions? Or was it not originally in the Gospel and then added later in some versions? Scholars are divided on this. The motivations surrounding the alteration of this verse appear very clear. In the prayer, Jesus would be formally wiping away the blame for those crucifying him, namely the Romans and Jews. Anti-Semitism was prevalent in certain sects of Christianity, and there were some groups who blamed and persecuted the Jewish people for crucifying Jesus. These groups might have found it in their best interest to omit the line to justify their actions. Others suggest adding the line would allow the gospel to gain wider acceptance in a Roman audience and under a Roman government, who might be pleased with being explicitly absolved of Jesus' execution. To this day, we still don't know, and perhaps will never know, which verse came first and why. Was the prayer forgiveness originally there, or not? All we know is that one of the variants is not the original, and that the text has been altered at some point. Is our modern version wrong, or are the older versions incorrect? We don't know. The Johannine comma. The Trinity, or the Christian Godhead, is a central doctrine in most sects of Christianity today, which states God is one, but also three distinct beings at the same time: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or Holy Ghost. The concept is so commonplace in the religion now that some believers never learn that there was once in fact much heated and even violent and even deadly debate between Christians that believed in the Trinity and those that did not. If one reads carefully, the doctrine is never explicitly stated in the New Testament, and was thus not solidified in the canon nor believed by all Christians for centuries. One of the few verses in the New Testament that outright state the doctrine of the Trinity appears in chapter 5, verse 7 and 8 of the first epistle of John, reading in the King James Bible as, "There are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one." That particular statement, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one," has come under question by modern biblical scholars. It does not appear in any of our oldest manuscripts of this text. All of these instead read like this: "For there are three that testify, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and the three are in agreement." Or, "There are three witness bearers, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood." Even early Christians that believed in the Trinity, such as Clement of Alexandria, when quoting this particular verse, did not include the extra words, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. The extra words have been given the name the Johannine comma by modern scholars, and is overwhelmingly understood to be an addition to the original version of 1 John, first appearing in the Latin Vulgate after the 9th century, and in Greek manuscripts in the 15th century. In all older manuscripts, the comma is completely absent. The comma seems to have originated as a marginal note in some Latin manuscripts during the Middle Ages. However, over time the marginal note was either accidentally or intentionally incorporated into the actual text of the Vulgate. These altered texts of the Vulgate were then translated back into Greek, which then served as the basis for the English King James versions. It is now widely recognized that the Johannine comma, one of the only examples where the Trinity is explicitly stated in the Bible, was not a part of the original text of 1 John, and since the late 1800s have perhaps correctly been omitted in future versions of the Bible. Check what your Bible says and see if it has kept the Johannine comma or removed it. Compassion or anger. Jesus is generally looked at as the picture of level-headedness and friendliness. However, in some versions of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 41, a very different and kind of bizarre picture is painted. In the excerpt, a leper, not a leopard, approaches Jesus, frantically begging him to heal his horrible illness, knowing that Jesus was said to work miracles on the sick or injured. Now, depending on the manuscript you are reading, Jesus responds to this man with either by feeling compassion or by becoming super angry at this man. Jesus then proceeds to heal him, and then, rebuking him severely, immediately he cast him out and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone." The now healed man apparently does not listen to Jesus and tells his miraculous experience to the inhabitants of a city, causing a stir to the point Jesus was no longer able to enter into the city publicly. Now, this rather odd story is made difficult to comprehend by the strongly conflicting versions of Jesus' emotions toward the sick man in it. In some manuscripts, Jesus gets angry or irritated at him, while in others, Jesus feels pity or compassion for him. Two polar opposite emotions, and two completely different Greek words. Clearly not the work of a simple scribal mistake, but an intentional change. But which one was the original? Most modern English translators favor the Jesus feeling compassion version, as it is written in the majority of the manuscripts and fits the common image of Jesus as a kind and well-tempered man. However, this choice might be wrong, and it is possible that the feeling anger reading with the angry Jesus is the original and the compassionate one is the alteration. Why might this be the case? In contrast with the other Gospels, Jesus, as portrayed in Mark, is not the nicest person. He's charismatic, but not exactly soft-spoken. He's not the sanitized nice guy of Luke or Matthew, but a stern and strong man that emerges from the wilderness on a mission. He gets angry and loses his temper several times in Mark in a manner he rarely does so in the other Gospels. For example, Jesus looks at those in a synagogue with anger when they watch him heal a man with a withered hand. Jesus getting irritated with the man asking to be healed also appears to fit the resolution of the story better than the feeling compassion version. If you notice, after healing the man, Jesus kicks him out and sternly orders him to, well, shut up, which the man doesn't follow. Jesus seemingly wanted to keep a low profile when entering the city, and healing this man screwed that up. It is entirely possible that later scribes copying this verse in the Gospel of Mark thought it would be best to make Jesus nicer, rather than being kind of mean and stern, changing the word anger to compassion. Some scholars have noted that this would be more likely, as there would be little motive for Christian scribes to do the reversal, changing compassion to anger, though this is contested by other scholars. The point is, similar to Jesus' prayer on the cross in Luke, the verse has been changed, but we aren't exactly sure which version is the original. The ominous original ending. Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead, 3 days after his execution through crucifixion, is an especially important aspect of modern Christianity. Most people are familiar with this story, often retold around the holidays of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, or through films like The Passion of the Christ. The Gospels each provide slightly discrepant accounts of how after Jesus' death, his body was placed in a tomb which was sealed by a large stone. A group of 3, or 2, or a single woman, depending on which Gospel you are reading, visits the tomb and finds that the massive stone has been rolled away and Jesus' body missing. The Gospels kind of differ with what happened next. The Gospel of Mark's version is especially interesting when you reach this part of the story. Mark 16 states, "The 3 women, one of whom is Mary Magdalene, find a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting, and they get freaked out. He says, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you.'" It is generally interpreted that this man in white is an angel or messenger of God who tells the women that Jesus is alive in the region of Galilee, and they should tell Jesus' disciples of what they have found and pursue him. Mark 16 verse 8 concludes with, "So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Apparently, they, the women, do not listen to God's instructions and do not tell their fellow disciples or anyone of what they saw or were told, instead keeping it a secret. Now, here's where things get very, very interesting. In most modern English Bibles, Mark chapter 16 continues after verse 8. Verses 9 through 18 tell of how Jesus himself, back from the dead, appears to first Mary Magdalene. She later tells several disciples who do not believe her. Jesus then appears in front of 2 unnamed disciples who are once again not believed. Then, for a third time, Jesus appears to all of the 11 remaining apostles at a dinner. Verses 19 and 20 conclude with Jesus finally leaving, ascending into heaven, and sitting at God's right hand, concluding with the disciples going out and preaching his message and return to the world. Now, the ending of Mark's Gospel has been the source of much textual criticism and debate. Many biblical scholars have found discrepancies that call into question the authenticity of verses 9 through 20. Our oldest and most complete copies of Mark, the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, both end at Mark 16 verse 8, with the 3 women departing from Jesus' empty tomb and the man in white, and telling no one of what they saw there. No Jesus appearing to Mary Mag, nor to the 2 disciples, nor to the 11 apostles at dinner. These manuscripts are not damaged or missing pages or anything. The story just ends there, with the scribe denoting the conclusion of the document by writing kata Markon, or according to Mark, after verse 8, and then continuing to copy the Gospel of Luke. Nothing has been erased or removed from the documents here. It is only in later texts made around or after 400 AD that we get the long ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20, seen in our modern Bibles. Once again we are confronted with a predicament. The oldest manuscripts omit verses 9 through 20, while later ones include verses 9 through 20. There is also a rival third ending of Mark that can be found in a select few manuscripts called the short ending, which picks up after verse 8 and states that the women reported their story to Peter and Jesus appears to them. Some later manuscripts only have the long ending, some only have the short, others have a Frankenstein combination of long and short, and finally some have neither, preferring to end at verse 8. Woof, so many competing versions makes you want to pull your hair out, doesn't it? You probably are asking yourself which one was the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. Most scholars agree that verses 9 through 20, that is, the long ending, was almost definitely not a part of the original text of Mark, but a later addition, a J.K. Rowling insertion, if you will. Many aspects such as the language and style of the verses, as well as all our oldest texts omitting them, support this theory. Most have concluded something similar about the short ending, which only appears in a select few later manuscripts. Now, scholars debate what the original ending of Mark might have been if it wasn't the long or short endings. Some suggest that a fourth, as of yet unknown ending after verse 8 has been lost to history. However, others suggest that the Gospel of Mark very well might have originally ended at verse 8, with the other endings being tacked on by scribes centuries later. This changes everything, if true. When one reads the versions of Mark that end at verse 8, it actually makes one's retroactive view of the gospel very sad. In this version, nobody knows that Jesus has risen from the dead, because the women don't say anything, because they were afraid. And then it just ends. It's ambiguous, ominous, and abrupt, and sticks with the reader. It's a massive cliffhanger, and raises so many questions. The reader is left to ask, if the women didn't say anything to anyone, and thus nobody was able to pursue Jesus in Galilee, how did the disciples ever learn of the resurrection? Did they even learn? Was what the mysterious man in white said even true? We don't know. The author doesn't tell us. In this version, we don't actually see Jesus alive after his crucifixion, just the empty tomb. We are simply told of it and left to wonder what happened next. Some might shout, how could that be the ending? But researchers have pointed out that this abrupt ending is actually very in line with the themes and motifs of Mark. In Mark, unlike with the other Gospels, many people, even Jesus' followers, repeatedly do not listen to his or God's instructions. The disciples on several occasions just don't seem to get it, and do not understand Jesus' sayings, sometimes to his aggravation. The abrupt ending very well might be a callback to the beginning of Mark, where Jesus heals the leper, and he orders him not to tell anyone about it, but the man does not listen and tells the whole city. Perhaps ironically, the author is pointing out that when God orders people to do the opposite, proclaim and spread his word, they choose once again to disobey and stay silent, leaving the reader with an impactful, punch-in-the-gut moral lesson about obedience. Later scribes, perhaps missing this message, could not handle this abrupt and somewhat uncomfortable ending to the gospel, and thus added the 12 verses we see in our modern Bibles. Whatever the reasons for their additions were, we can be pretty certain that the ending or endings seen in our modern English Bibles is not the original, and was an intentional change. Before we reach the number 1 change, I'd like to do a rapid-fire round listing off some minor changes with shorter explanations. If you want to learn more, you can look these up for yourself. Alrighty. There are some intentional changes that appear to have been localizations of the text. Just like how Japanese manga translations sometimes must be altered to best fit a region, so was the Bible. One of these can be seen in Matthew 16, in the passage where Jesus talks about the weather. When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky. Some manuscripts have left out this verse, while others have it. Scholars theorize that it was removed by copyists in regions like Egypt because in these climates a red sky in the morning does not announce rain. Audiences in climates like these might read Jesus' statement and think he didn't know what he was talking about. Some changes probably were done as a way to resolve perceived contradictions through the use of retcons.
Christians sometimes suggest that the story of Jesus must be true because how else would we have Christianity? They suggest that something must have given the gospel writers their ideas, even if they exaggerated a little. Now these Christians naively imagine that without an historical Jesus, we have a terrible problem explaining the colourful New Testament story. But you know, that isn't so. The answer is very simple, not to say obvious. In other words, the story of Jesus is counterfeit. It's simply rehashed earlier material. Now, defenders of the faith have had to respond to the charge of copying their ideas from the very beginning. For example, the Epicurean rationalist Celsus in the 2nd century said that Plato had expressed the same ideas put onto the lips of Jesus, but in a purer form. The satirist Lucian, also of the 2nd century, described the Christians as childlike, easily fooled by any charlatan who wrote gospels for them. Now, Christian apologetics spends a lot of time and effort trying to reject or marginalise the obvious wealth of evidence that the Christians copied their fables in depth and in detail, but unfortunately for them, they have one insuperable difficulty. The early Christians themselves admitted that the devil had read the Jewish prophets first and had arranged for the pagan religions to anticipate the entire life and death of Jesus. In other words, the mystery religions had been counterfeited in advance of the Jesus story. For example, the first voice of Christian orthodoxy, a man known to history as Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century, actually said, "The wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras the taking of bread and the drinking of wine." Justin also complains that when Perseus was begotten of a virgin, the deceiving serpent counterfeited this also. Justin even admits that in Jesus Christ, Christians are propounding nothing different from what the pagans believed regarding the sons of Jupiter. Now, the sons of Jupiter included such gods as Hermes, the Word of God, Asclepius, the healer, and Hercules, a god-man born of a virgin who performed miracles, and almost killed as a child, he eventually became a god. Sounds a tad familiar, does it not? In fact, all the salient characteristics of Jesus were commonplace in the ancient world, and the early Christians knew that. They didn't even try to deny it. The pagans had had their shrines and fables for centuries, in some cases thousands of years before the Christians recycled the same stories into a Jewish context. Now, some of today's Christians, troubled one suspects by the widespread and detailed prefiguring of Jesus in earlier religions, respond in one of two ways. They either argue fairly desperately that Jesus deliberately set out to fit the prototypes, or that all these earlier prototypes were part of God's grand plan, as if he repeatedly initiated saviour myths in multiple cultures, differing only in marginal details, in God's own determination to get his message across. Which illustrates more than anything else the determination of some people to cling to cherished ideas rather than face reality. But that doesn't make the fairy tale true, and it doesn't turn fable into history. Those stories remain as ever they were, astounding rubbish from the New Testament.
So far we can tell that the Bible has a long history dating back through many changes, multiple edits, corrections. Things changed to match up with older prophecies, older Romans creating their own version of Jesus so that the Romans would love them, and so on. And there was actually a split off earlier on to the Catholic version, which was the Constantine stuff, versus the other Romans, the Flavians, who decided to create their own Jesus. So I think we have enough evidence there to see that this is all just mythology mixed based on the certain different dynamics and groups of the time, as well as politics of the time. So we've got enough to say that the New Testament is basically full of shit and Jesus didn't exist. So let's start looking into Nephilim and the gods. Because remember, Christianity has the one and only true God. Or does it?
Today, I've set out to discuss perhaps the strangest and most perplexing of the beings referenced in the Bible. Odds are most of you have at the very least heard of the word Nephilim or Nephilim, as on the internet they appear to be a good way of attracting some, let's politely say, interesting people with out-of-the-ordinary beliefs and theories. From dinosaurs to giant, violent, dinosaur-fighting humanoids as depicted by my buddy Ken Ham, to fallen angels trapped as rock monsters as the 2014 film Noah depicts, to the hybrid offspring of humans and angels or demons, to, of course, aliens. Yes, I've heard people claim all kinds of things about the Nephilim, and it seems like a lot of people, namely religious ones, mainly Christians, have questions about them, and perhaps this is justified, and to be expected from their obscurity, and the in-passing nature in which they're referenced in the Bible. The Nephilim are only mentioned 2 to maybe 3 times in the entire Bible, the 2 undisputed ones coming from the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books. And like the Leviathan and Behemoth, these references are incredibly brief and in passing, as if the audience should already kind of know what they are, and I bet this is why many have left from reading about them in the Bible unsatisfied and hankering for some rather outlandish answers and conclusions. So, in this video, I will attempt to examine the significance and meaning of the Nephilim, and by proxy, the sons of God mentioned in the Old Testament, in the original ancient context the authors of the Bible intended. The Nephilim. To start our deconstruction, let's first examine the word Nephilim or Nephilim itself. Some versions of the Bible simply translate the word as giants, but in actuality the Hebrew word Nephilim literally translates to the fallen ones. Now, the fallen meaning to their name has caused some to believe the Nephilim are fallen angels or demons from heaven. However, this interpretation is likely wrong. Modern biblical scholars understand that the specific word used is intended to mean fallen in death, mainly associated with the heroic death of a great warrior. The verb derivative of the word is commonly used to describe the deaths of individuals, specifically warriors, such as in David's lament over the death of Saul and Jonathan, how the warriors are fallen. So a better translation would maybe be the killed ones or the slain ones, and this significance to their name makes sense in accordance to some of the verses in which they are mentioned. Now to the Nephilim's actual appearance in the Bible. The Nephilim show up extremely scantly. Their first mention is in Genesis 6:4. Genesis 6:4 is one of the weirdest verses in the entire Bible, and that's not me talking, that's the opinion of actual biblical scholars. For one thing, it is rather strangely and somewhat randomly sandwiched in between the long genealogies of Adam's descendants and right at the beginning of the famous Noah's flood story. Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 through 4 reads, "When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw they were fair, and took wives of themselves for all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh, their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown." Genesis 6:5 then abruptly changes the subject and talks about how God saw the wickedness of humanity and decides to flood the earth, killing his creations, save Noah, his family, and some animals. And I think most of us know what happens from there. So what are we to make of these verses? Well, for starters, we can see that the Nephilim continue to be associated with heroic warriors, as their name suggests. They appear to have been given the epithet or nickname, heroes or mighty men of old. men or warriors of renown. The Nephilim appear to be like Hercules or Achilles or Gilgamesh to the ancient Hebrews, heroes from a bygone age that according to the text seems to suggest existed before and slightly after the Great Flood that God sent to kill off almost all of humanity. Genesis 6:3, in which God claims no human shall live past 120 years old, seems again to be kind of random and interrupts the flow of Genesis 1-2 and Genesis 4. However, it might suggest that these Nephilim might have achieved long lifespans and ages that are no longer attainable in the modern day, after the flood, in which the author is writing. If we look at the ages given by the Bible for pre-flood humans, they're consistently in the hundreds. Adam lives for 930 years old. Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, lives for 969. Lamech, Noah's father, lives 777 years old. And Enoch lives for 365 years old, but technically never dies, but that's a story for another day. This idea that humans that dwelled before the Great Flood, in this mythic antediluvian age, lived for much longer lives compared to those after is in fact a belief that the Bible and other ancient religious texts of the region, specifically the Sumerian king list, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and writings of Berosus share. Among other things, this further illustrates the point that we discussed in my Leviathan video, that the early Hebrews had a lot in common religiously with the Sumerians, Babylonians, and other cultures of the region. Perhaps the most important detail we can gather about the Nephilim here is that they are the offspring, or to put it more bluntly, the product of sex between the daughters of men or humans, and perhaps more perplexingly, the sons of God. Keep this in the back of your mind because we'll return to this in a little bit. Now, it might be important to note that Genesis and the Pentateuch in general were not written by one author, typically ascribed by tradition to Moses, but by several. The work of many diligent scholars has revealed that Genesis was written by several independent authors with their own unique diction, grammar, and writing styles, as well as interpretations, and this widely accepted explanation among scholars is called the documentary hypothesis. The doc hypothesis provides evidence for at the very least 4 different authors, D, E, P, and J. Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 appears to have been written by the author known as P, or the priestly source. This author is probably most distinguishable from his primary counterpart J, or the Yahweh source, due to, among other things, the word he uses for the name of God. He always uses El, or Elohim, while J always uses Yahweh instead. In Genesis, especially in Genesis 6, it appears these two authors flip back and forth almost constantly, with P telling a story in his own way, while J tells the same if not identical story in his own, with slight variations between the two. This is probably the reason why there are duplications of almost everything in Genesis, namely 2 creation stories. What is happening here is the work of 2, and sometimes more, different authors' works are being merged together or interspliced and mixed with one another, resulting in the Bible we know today. The Bible was a collaborative effort, and the Old Testament appears to have been constructed in a manner similar to the Gospels, where different authors contributed their own message as opposed to one singular one by the name of Moses. Anyways, the reason I mention the documentary hypothesis here is that these multiple authors might be the reason why the text appears to jolt back and forth, sometimes drastically from one thing to another, and I think it's important to keep in the back of our minds when discussing the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, as it allows us to accept when things don't properly or perfectly mesh together, or when we encounter a bit of a contradiction. Professor Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible is a great book if you want to learn more about the subject. We'll return to Genesis 6 and the sons of God in a little bit, but let us first move on to the next mention of the Nephilim. The Nephilim are absent for a whole 3 books, and then out of nowhere reappear in the book of Numbers. So to set the stage, Moses and the Jewish people have escaped slavery from Egypt, as described in Exodus, and after receiving the 10 Commandments and wandering the desert for 40 years, they are just about ready to enter into and take their promised land, Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine. The Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." So they went up and spied out the land, and they told him, "Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that they saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." So in this text, we learn quite a lot about the Nephilim. We learn that not only did they appear to have survived the Great Flood of Genesis, but their descendants, perhaps watered-down versions of the pre-flood Nephilim, inhabited the land of Canaan, the Jewish Holy Land, before the Jewish conquest of the region. These Nephilim are also giants, huge and strong men of ginormous proportions. It is unclear how big the Nephilim are, but they are large enough to be a huge intimidation. And they also are said to eat people. It is unclear what happened to the Nephilim, as they don't appear to be referenced explicitly after Numbers 13, but we can assume that they perished or were killed in battle or something during the Israelites' conquest of Canaan, as the region the Nephilim inhabited later became Israel, and they don't inhabit it anymore. This description of the Nephilim as giants seems to reflect back on them being great and mighty warriors and fighters. A possible final reference to the Nephilim is all the way in Ezekiel 32:27. Ezekiel 32 discusses death and afterlife in the Hebrew religion. Now, the reason I say possible reference is because there appears to be two versions of Ezekiel 32:27 floating around. The Masoretic text, or MT version, and the Septuagint, or LXX, or Old Greek version. Now, the Masoretic text is what the Old Testament and most Christian Bibles, specifically the King James translation and its derivatives, and the American Standard Version, are based off of, and translated from. The MT was copied and translated by a sect of Jews in the 7th to 10th centuries CE or AD. The Septuagint text is a Greek translation of ancient Hebrew text translated in the mid-3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, LXX being slightly older than the MT version. The reason I bring up these two translations of the Bible is because LXX and MT possess drastically different versions of Ezekiel 32:27. The Masoretic text and the version that has ended up in most Christian Bibles reads like this: "But they do not lie with the fallen warriors of old, who went down to the realm of the dead with their weapons of war, their swords placed on their heads and their shields, resting on their bones, though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living." The Septuagint version reads like this: "They lie with the warriors, the Nephilim of old, who descended to Sheol with their weapons of war. They placed their swords beneath their heads and their shields upon their bones, for the terror of the warriors was upon the land of the living." One says the descendants of one of Noah's sons, who died in battle uncircumcised, do not lie with fallen warriors in the Jewish realm of the dead or Sheol, while the other, older text claims they do. Modern biblical scholars almost unanimously agree that the MT version, the version in most Bibles, is mistaken, and the original text should read like LXX does. If this is the case, we have yet another last appearance of the Nephilim. Yet again, the Nephilim are described as fallen or slain warriors of old, the bygone days. The Nephilim now dwell in Sheol alongside other warriors who died in battle. Sheol, in the ancient Hebrew religion, is understood to be neither heaven or hell by biblical scholars. Rather, Sheol has much more in common with the Greek Hades or underworld, and in Ezekiel it seems like Sheol is most similar to the realm of Elysium in the Greek underworld. Elysium is a location in the afterlife reserved for the souls of great warriors and heroes, which seems similar to what the author is describing, a special location in the afterlife for warriors throughout history, the Nephilim named among them. For any more references to the Nephilim, we need to look at Hebrew text outside of the canonical Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient Hebrew texts dating around 400 BCE to 300 CE, are a mix of manuscripts, many of them being the oldest surviving copies of biblical texts like Genesis, Deuteronomy, etc. Around 40% of these texts are copies of the biblical text. However, mixed in with these books are non-canonical books. Books ancient Hebrews read and likely valued just as much as some of the other books that are in the Bible, but eventually fell out of favor and thus were removed from the canon, and didn't end up in the Bible we have today. One of these non-canonical books is the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is centuries younger than Genesis, Numbers, and Ezekiel, dating around the 300s BCE, so its relevance to these ancient texts might be a little different. The book expands on the Nephilim extensively. The Nephilim are said to be the descendants of the Watchers, or angels and humans. There is another text of the Dead Sea Scrolls written around 100 BCE called the Book of Giants, which seems to be a bit of a sequel to the Book of Enoch. Much of the same information given in the Book of Enoch is repeated in Giants. One of the interesting bits of information is that a few Nephilim are named: the Sumerian hero and king Gilgamesh, and the mythical giant intestine monster Humbaba, both legendary sort of demigods from the ancient Sumerian story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, are named as Nephilim or giants that existed before the great Noah's flood. And that's about all the information we are given about the Nephilim from ancient Hebrew sources. And from these texts we can say quite a lot about the Nephilim, which I will list out. So, firstly, and most importantly, we know they are in the older texts the hybrid offspring of the sons of God and female humans, or, according to more recent non-canonical texts, the offspring of angels and female humans. We also know they were giant, legendary, heroic, and mighty warriors, likely akin to Achilles or Gilgamesh, that have fallen or were killed in battle. They belong to a distant, bygone period of Hebrew history, before the flood and before Israel's founding. The Nephilim are associated with a heroic death in warfare, and dwelled in the Hebrew afterlife of Sheol, with other warriors in history, namely those who were uncircumcised, in a manner similar to Elysium in Greek mythology, and maybe even Valhalla in Norse mythology. The Nephilim in non-canonical sources are associated with demigods and legendary mythical characters from neighboring polytheistic religions, such as the Mesopotamian religion. Now, the picture that is starting to build in accordance to the textual evidence is that the Nephilim to ancient Hebrews were legendary demigod-like heroes that existed, fought, and achieved a type of status in the past, but are now no longer. I think the Nephilim might have been very similar to demigod figures that achieved greatness in their lives in the respective religions of the Hebrews' contemporaries, like Hercules, Perseus, Jason, and Achilles in Greek mythology, or Gilgamesh in Sumerian mythology. It seems the ancient Hebrews' neighbors all believed in heroic men of divine origin, achieving greatness in the past, and the Hebrew authors were simply acknowledging and incorporating these foreign myths and beliefs into the Bible, and making their own Hebrew version of these figures, much like what happened to Leviathan. And the evidence and the scholarly consensus supports this conclusion. But I know what you're going to say. Isn't Judaism, and by proxy the Bible itself, monotheistic, having one God? So wouldn't that mean the existence of demigods and sons of God contradict this point and seemingly suggest Judaism isn't monotheistic after all? Well, to address your question, the real key to understanding the Nephilim is understanding their fathers, the sons of God referenced in Genesis 6, as well as the origins and development of the Hebrew religion.
Uh-oh. Did something that they forgot to remove from the Bible, or they decided to reference in the Bible, actually lead us on a journey to where there is more than one God? Let's find out.
Part 2. Sons of God. I think the first step to understanding who the sons of God are is to look at the phrase itself. The Hebrew words used here is ben Elohim, and is often translated to the sons of God. But this might actually be a mistranslation, because the curious thing is that word used for God in the phrase is plural, Elohim, and not singular, El. It should be translated as gods, lowercase, not gods, singular, uppercase. So a more accurate and literal translation would be the sons of the gods, and not sons of God. As we have discussed earlier, God is called by many names in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes Yahweh, sometimes El, and sometimes as a plural, Elohim. Now you Christians that will claim this is evidence of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a much later belief not held by modern or even ancient Jews, hold your horses. Elohim is used interchangeably to describe both the Hebrew creator God, as in Genesis, and the non-specific polytheistic gods of other nations, such as Exodus 12:12. Against all the gods, Elohim, of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord, Yahweh. Or in Genesis 35:2, put away the strange gods, Elohim, that are among you. And it is even used to refer to Adam and Eve, if they eat the forbidden fruit, as they will become gods. Genesis 3:5. For God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, Elohim, knowing good and evil. Therefore, the first lines of the Bible should really read from a literal translation like this. In the beginning, the gods, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. And the passage in Genesis 6 should read, the sons of the gods. Perplexingly as this may be, keep this in the back of your mind for the moment, because we'll come back to it. The sons of the gods, or God, appear in other locations in the Old Testament, namely in Genesis 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God, ben Elohim, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. In this passage, these sons of God or gods appear in a divine court or meeting around Yahweh, and Satan appears to be interestingly among them as one of these sons. Now, if you look at your traditional Bible, this is the last mention of these sons of God, or gods, in the Old Testament. However, just like with Ezekiel 32:27, there are multiple versions or textual variants of the same verse that have drastically different meanings depending on which text/translation you are looking at. Deuteronomy 32:8 in your average King James or American Standard Bible, based off of the Masoretic text, reads like this: When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob was the lot of his inheritance. However, we in fact have many textual variants of this verse in particular. Firstly, the chronologically older translation, copies of the Septuagint or LXX version of Deuteronomy 32:8, most commonly read like this: When the Most High divided the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of angels of God. And his people, Jacob, became the portion of the Lord. Israel was the line of his inheritance. If you notice, the sons of Israel in this version has been replaced with the angels of God, a vastly different translation, and obviously not a mistake. Most interestingly of all, there are some versions of LXX that do not say angels of God or even sons of Israel, but the sons of the gods, or sons of God. To make it even more interesting, when archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they discovered the oldest surviving copies of the Deuteronomy text. The texts are relatively identical to LXX and the MT translation. However, in this verse, Deuteronomy 32:8 in particular, we have two different ancient copies that read like this: When Elyon gave the nations as an inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of sons of God, Ben Elohim. For Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob was the lot of his inheritance. What the heck is going on here? Well, it appears the text changed meaning in simply just this single phrase the further you go back and the closer you get to the original Hebrew authors. The text appears to have been originally sons of God or gods, but was gradually altered over time to angels and then to sons of Israel, humans. It's certainly weird and curious, and it seems we have a bit of a cover-up going on here. Why were translators so concerned with this single phrase? Well, it makes sense when you look at the meaning of the verse. The author is claiming that the Most High, Elyon, divided the world into nations in accordance to the number of sons of Elohim. Yahweh, the Jewish God's portion, is the Jewish peoples, Israel. Yahweh in this passage seems to be a distinct entity from El, the Most High, and it is highly implied that Yahweh is one of the sons of the gods, or God, rather than God himself. More interestingly, if we look at the number of nations in which the world was believed to be divided into in Genesis 10, or the generations of Noah, or the Table of Nations, the number of names and therefore nations given is 70. This number of 70 nations directly correlates to a concept in the Canaanite religion, the primary neighboring religion of the ancient Hebrews. In the Canaanite religion, the world was divided amongst the sons of the supreme god El and his goddess wife Asherah. And the number of these sons? 70, with each nation belonging to a corresponding son of God. Greece was given to Zeus, Babylon was given to Marduk, Assyria was given to Asher, and of course Israel was given to Yahweh. It is an undoubtedly polytheistic message. Yahweh, the Jewish God, isn't the supreme God, but a son of the Most High, and Israel is simply one nation that corresponds to this God, with the other nations each having their own respective son of the Most High, or their own God that they worship. An alternative interpretation by Professor Richard Friedman, given in his book The Exodus, is that Yahweh is the highest God and did divide it among his sons, Marduk, Asher, etc., but kept Israel for himself, rather than El and Yahweh being different entities. Regardless, the message stays the same. In the ancient Hebrew religion, other gods exist, and the sons of Elohim are the gods of other nations. Although most translators and modern believers tend to see these sons of God as angels, this does not seem to be the case in the original meaning of the text. As Professor John Day puts it in his book, Yahweh and the Other Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, originally these were gods, but as monotheism became absolute, so they were demoted to the status of angels. It appears that Judaism and the Bible in its ancient and original state was not fully monotheistic, but was somewhat polytheistic and was still connected to the religion of the Canaanites. It was only later changes and revisions that appear to have altered and removed evidence of these polytheistic references. There are other hints here and there of polytheism in the Pentateuch, and it makes you really rethink verses like Exodus 12:12. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both people and animal, and I will bring forth judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And Exodus 15:11, who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? It also makes one think about the reason why the Creator God was plural in Genesis. Psalms 82, or what Professor Richard Elliott Friedman dubs the myth of the death of God, says, God is standing in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. I said, you are gods and the children of the highest, or sons of the Most High, all of you. But like a human you will die, and like one of the rulers you will fall. The author of Psalm 82 claims that Yahweh is the highest among the gods, which exist, but condemns all of these gods to death like mere mortals, leaving only him, the death of the other gods. My apologies if this sounds like this is going off the deep end, but all you need to know is that these texts and verses strongly suggest that early Judaism and the biblical authors themselves believed in a version of Judaism slightly different than the versions believed today. This version of Judaism seems to have been partially polytheistic, if not polytheistic. The existence of other gods was not denied, rather they existed, but either Yahweh was among them, or the most powerful one, or their father. This is something called monolatry, and it is likely what the biblical authors and ancient Jews believed in. Yahweh or El wasn't the only god in existence, but there were many other gods, such as Asherah, El or Yahweh's sons, and the countless gods of neighboring nations, an entire pantheon. But it appears this original initial belief in partial polytheism in Judaism was either gradually or rapidly replaced with full-on monotheism we know today. The existence of other gods beside El Yahweh was denied, and text and traditions were changed and altered. As the textual variations of Deuteronomy 32:8 reflect, the other gods were demoted to the level of angels and attempted to be edited out entirely. How exactly Yahweh became the only god in existence is complex and perhaps a story for a better day. For now, let's get back to the sons of God and the Nephilim that started this whole thing. So, what are the Nephilim and the sons of God? Well, the Nephilim are likely Hebrew demigods, similar to Hercules and Achilles in Greek mythology. Heroic men created through the sexual union of women and the sons of God. These sons of God, or gods, are not exactly angels or demons, but gods themselves, the sons of El and Asherah, a female goddess. The passage and similar passages that seem to suggest the existence of other gods reflect early Judaism's relationship with the pre-existing polytheistic religions, most notably the religions of the Canaanites, Babylonians, and Greeks. At some point in history, these references were attempted to be edited out or altered to avoid Judaism's association with polytheism. However, their traces remained, and some texts from this ancient period in history survived, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserving Judaism's polytheistic leanings. To best put it, the Nephilim and the sons of God are vestigial remnants of a different kind of Judaism than the modern Abrahamic faiths we are familiar with. They are like the Leviathan, a carryover from an older age, and an older religion, a time when there was not God, but gods in Israel.
And there it is. In an attempt to edit out, they left in, which led us back to more than one God. So your book's fucked. Created from multiple different religions and mythologies of the period. Multiple Jesuses exist, or at least were created by multiple different religious sects. And your book then broke into two, with Constantine pretty much spearheading the Catholic version, whilst Flavius decided to mirror the journey he took, creating his own Jesus, and rewrote it so it's more of a nice Jesus, a kind Jesus, the Jesus that his people would want to follow. So we find out that the Jesus is a load of rubbish. The New Testament's a load of rubbish that was created to back up the prophecies from the Old Testament, which was a bunch of rubbish from a mixture of different religions, which leads us to the one God, which too is a load of fucking rubbish and a mixture of multiple gods from multiple different religions. And if you still claim to believe in your one God, one Jesus, the book, and that is the way, there's something wrong with you upstairs. But let's take a look at the last thing that was left in the Bible and not edited out, that probably should have been, because it links every religion around the world. Leviathan.
What is Leviathan exactly? Well, Leviathan appears in the Bible a few times, 6 to be exact, but only rather briefly and in passing, in a manner as if the reader should already kind of know what it is. Well, we can first learn a bit from the word Leviathan itself. Firstly, the word is singular and denotes an individual as opposed to a species. The word is a name for a specific individual, like the Minotaur or the Hydra or Jormungandr. The etymology or origin of the word associates it with the Hebrew words of to coil, to twist, and its name translates to the twisting one, or the wreath-like one, or the circular one. The name itself is strongly associated with descriptions of a snake, particularly one in an Ouroboros position. Additionally, this aspect of Leviathan's name has been suggested by some scholars to suggest Leviathan is a primeval sea serpent that encircles the earth with its body, which is a belief held by some of the Israelites' neighbors. Some Babylonian artwork often depicts a giant serpent coiled around the earth in a circle, serving as its foundations, and this seems reminiscent of the Norse mythological serpent of Jormungandr, or the world serpent, which similarly surrounds the earth with its body. These legends are in turn reminiscent of other mythologies where a giant serpent-like monster serves as the foundation of Earth, particularly the ones of Sumer, in which the defeated giant sea serpent Tiamat's corpse is used. Because of all this, scholars have suggested that Leviathan may or may not have served a similar purpose in ancient Hebrew mythology, as a giant creature that encircles the globe or whose body serves as its foundation. And this is somewhat further supported by the actual textual evidence we will examine later. The longest description of Leviathan occurs in the book of Job, but it is briefly mentioned in Psalms, Amos, and Isaiah in passing, essentially as a mere allusion or name drop, if you will. So let's look at the text and look at the description given. In Job, Leviathan and Behemoth are alluded to in a speech by Yahweh, or God, that he gives to Job, a man who is questioning God for making him suffer. In his speech, God essentially says humanity is ignorant and weak, unable to comprehend or understand his knowledge and reasons, and therefore God should not be questioned. Several mysteries for people of that age are mentioned by God in a form of a question. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea and walked in the recesses of the deep? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off the dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of hail, which are reserved for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? Essentially what is being said here is that humans cannot do or know these mysteries, only God can. And then Leviathan and Behemoth are mentioned with the same type of rhetoric as an allusion. Can you pull Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie its tongue down with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. Essentially what is being said here is that Leviathan is quite an adversary, and no mere human has any hope of subduing it. Only God can. I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength, and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields, tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the necks that no air can pass between them. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. Leviathan here is covered with a thick, scaly, armored hide that again no human has any hope of piercing. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze and flames dart from its mouth. Leviathan here has glowing eyes and can breathe fire like a dragon. Strength resides in its neck, dismay goes before it. The folds of its flesh are tightly joined, they are firm and immobile. Its chest is hard as a rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified, they retreat before its thrashing. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear or dart or javelin. Iron it treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make it flee. Sling stones are like chaff to it. A club seems to it but a piece of straw. It laughs at the rattling of a lance. Here, Leviathan is again very strong and very large, unbelievably large, with no human having any chance against it. Its undersides are like jagged pot shears, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sled. It makes the deep churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Leviathan is again very large and very monstrous. And this is pretty much it for Leviathan and Job. Job repents after hearing this speech and concedes that he is weak while God is strong and unquestionable. Note that Leviathan is not being described or seen by Job or the author, and he is certainly not an eyewitness. It is merely offhandedly mentioned in a speech by Yahweh. It appears the entire point of Leviathan's appearance in Job is rhetorical, to further point out the weakness, ignorance, and insignificance of humanity in relation to the universe and contrast it with the power, intelligence, and supremacy of Yahweh. We are repeatedly shown that Leviathan and Behemoth is unstoppable. Humans with all our knowledge and power are useless compared to the strength of these beasts. Essentially, the point of this entire passage is to contrast humanity's weakness and vulnerability with God's power over such creatures. Leviathan is pretty much just a symbol and a piece of imagery for the author to give the audience to relay this point. We can learn a lot about Leviathan through the rhetorical questions posed by Yahweh, essentially stating that humans cannot subdue or defeat such a powerful creature, while God can. Leviathan reappears later in Psalms within an apparent recollection of the creation of the earth by the author. But God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours and yours also the night. You established the sun and the moon. It was you who set the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. From this we can understand that Leviathan has multiple heads, and was apparently murdered by God in a past battle, implied to be in the context of the creation of the world, just like the many other listed accomplishments God has done in the passage, like creating the sun and moon and creating the earth. The murder of Leviathan is listed alongside other aspects involved in the creation of the earth, and it seems likely that all these events are related. Leviathan's corpse appears to have been dismembered and redistributed by God as food for creatures of the earth. Leviathan is name dropped again later in Psalms, where it is listed alongside God's many works and accomplishments. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. So is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and large beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan whom thou hast made to play therein. Leviathan is now alive and is said to live in the sea, and is named separately from the other great and small beasts of the sea. Leviathan is name dropped again in Isaiah. In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fugitive serpent, and Leviathan the crooked serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Leviathan is prophesied by the author to engage in a battle with Leviathan in the future. Leviathan is again specified as a serpent and a dragon, and is associated with the ocean. Leviathan is mentioned one last time in Amos, as the serpent that lives at the bottom of the ocean. Additionally, there appears to be a connection with Leviathan, a very similar creature in the Old Testament by the name of Rahab. No, not the woman. Briefly mentioned in Psalms and Isaiah. Rahab appears to be a nickname for Egypt in some cases, but not so in others. God will not turn back his anger. Beneath him bowed the helpers of Rahab. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his spirit he hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked serpent, Rahab. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain, and with your strong arm you shattered your enemies. The heavens are yours, and yours also the earth. You founded the world and all that is in it. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Wake, as in days of old, the generations long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces and pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? In some circumstances, Rahab is referred to as the fugitive serpent, a title given to Leviathan in Isaiah 27. Leviathan and Rahab are additionally mentioned alongside each other in some passages. Additionally, both are described as dragon-like creatures that are associated with the sea and defeated and dismembered by God in a past event. Both are associated with the stilling of the oceans and possibly the creation of the earth. And the scholarly consensus is that Rahab and Leviathan appear to be two names for the same entity, which are sometimes used interchangeably with one another. The name Rahab is associated with the Hebrew word for rage and tremble, especially its derivative to overflow, which makes sense with Rahab's association with the sea and ocean. And yep, that's about it for Leviathan Rahab. He's mentioned here and there with limited details about his origins and significance. A lot of the information about the creature is fragmentary and doesn't all fit together cohesively 100%. However, from all this we can get a pretty firm understanding of what Leviathan is. Number 1. Leviathan is a great sea serpent-like dragon creature with multiple heads. Number 2. Leviathan is strongly associated with the ocean, typically the abyss or deep. Number 3. Leviathan is associated with the concept of chaos and disorder in said ocean, with God stilling or calming the ocean into order alongside killing Leviathan in a big battle. Number 4. Leviathan in his battle with God appears to have been originally associated with the creation of the universe. Number 5. Leviathan and Yahweh are adversaries to one another. Number 6. Leviathan's corpse is dismembered and redistributed by Yahweh after his defeat. And lastly, number 7. Leviathan appears to be possibly associated with the foundation of the world, possibly surrounding it or circling it with its body. It is becoming clear that Leviathan isn't a dinosaur or even a real animal in the slightest, but a mythological one more in line with the Hydra or Minotaur or Pegasus. Biblical scholars throughout history have attempted to try to comprehend Leviathan Rahab with many vastly different interpretations. However, modern scholars commonly accept that the Leviathan that is alluded to is a primordial sea serpent which God battled at the beginning of time in order to create the universe. Some scholars have noted that the killing and subduing of Leviathan in the context of the creation of the earth is reminiscent of the creation of the earth given in Genesis, with the calming of the primeval waters or the deep that existed before. Oxford Old Testament professor John Day suggests that the creation story given in Genesis 1 is the demythologized version of the Leviathan creation story given in bits and pieces in various other parts of the Old Testament. This battle between God and this horrible sea serpent has been dubbed the Chaos Kampf, and it appears to be something ancient Hebrews believed in but has been largely edited out or demythologized out of the biblical canon over the centuries. Now, it's rather important to take a look at the cultural context of these biblical books. To the ancient Hebrews, the original authors and audience of these texts, the main neighbors of the ancient Hebrews would have been the Canaanites and the Babylonians. Now, in the mythology of the Canaanites, we have a text known as the Baal cycle, which is a collection of various stories relating to Baal, a storm god and head of many Mesopotamian pantheons. One story recollects Baal's battle with the god of the sea, Yam. Yam plans to rule over all the other gods and sends his servant/pet Lotan or Litan, or the twisting serpent or the mighty one with 7 heads, a 7-headed sea dragon, to attack Baal. Baal manages to defeat Lotan, and then Yam is defeated in a big battle. Firstly, we should note that Lotan and Leviathan are incredibly similar, with almost identical epithets or nicknames, the wiggling serpent and the twisting serpent. The two are also closely associated with the sea and ocean, and both have multiple heads, and both are defeated by a god. Additionally, the description of Leviathan in Isaiah 27 verse 1, "On that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the twisting serpent, Leviathan the crooked serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea," is almost quoted directly from the Baal epic, created almost 1,000 years earlier, where Mot, a god, says to Baal that you smote Lotan, the twisting serpent, and made an end to the crooked serpent. Again, suggesting the two creatures are one of the same, or at least related or inspired by one another. A similar myth is attested to in the Babylonian creation story of Enuma Elish. In this text, before the earth was created, there was only Tiamat, the chaotic salt water, and her lover Abzu, the calmer freshwater. Tiamat is described as a giant great sea serpent or dragon. Tiamat and Abzu mate, producing the lesser gods. Abzu is murdered by the lesser gods, and Tiamat is filled with rage and attempts to get revenge. She births countless monsters to kill the lesser gods. Marduk, god of the storms, engages in a massive battle with Tiamat and subdues her. He slices her corpse in two, using one part to create the heavens and the other the foundations of the earth. Again, we see similarities between Leviathan, Lotan, and Tiamat. In all three stories, a god, namely one that is associated with storms, Yahweh does speak to Job and other people in the storm, duels with a giant sea serpent associated with chaos in the ocean. In Enuma Elish in the Bible, Tiamat and Leviathan are dismembered and reused by the respective victor gods, and both are used in the creation of the universe. Although some elements differ, many elements of the Chaos Kampf are shared between all three stories. Modern scholarship generally agrees it appears imagery and influence from the older Babylonian and Canaanite religious stories were incorporated or inspired into the Bible and reappropriated to better fit the Hebrew canon and God. Essentially, the authors of the Bible kept the crux of the story that they've been hearing a lot from their neighbors, but recasted it with their own versions of the characters. The Hebrew authors and their audience obviously would have been familiar with these stories of their neighbors, whom they commonly traded and communicated with. It's very clear elements from both religions at the very least influenced the imagery of Job and other texts. However, the chaos cup is more common than you think, and it is found outside of religions just in the Middle East, and there are in fact seemingly many separate and unrelated religions that appear to possess the common story of the battle between the chaos serpent and the storm god. We actually find the story everywhere, from Zeus battling the serpentine monster Typhon in Greek mythology, to Ra battling the chaos serpent Apep in Egyptian mythology, to Thor battling the world serpent Jormungandr in Norse mythology, to Indra battling Vattriya in Hindu mythology. And the list goes on, with elements of the story maybe being found as far as Japan and the Americas. There appears to be a popular mythic trope or meme that exists in many religions and mythologies. This is something called comparative mythology. It's when religions and mythologies share commonalities with one another, and it appears that chaos comp is one of the most common and prevalent of all of them. Although there are many ways these stories vary from one another, they still retain fundamental similarities. In almost every iteration of the story, there is a multi-headed sea serpent creature which typically embodies chaos, with a godly opponent with an association with thunderstorms. The two characters duel, and the serpent always loses. And modern religious scholarship seems to agree that the commonalities are too numerous in some cases to be pure coincidence. The prevalence of this myth or story has been debated over decades, but it appears that this is a result of both cultural diffusion, that is the communication and transmission of ideas from culture to culture, as well as a result of common origin. Across Eurasia, from England to India, there appears to be strong similarities not just in mythologies, but in the languages themselves. And from this, it is believed all cultures from the Greeks and Romans to Indians to the Norse people of Scandinavia all descend from what have been dubbed the Proto-Indo-Europeans, whose culture widely spread throughout the prehistoric world in the late Neolithic. The Proto-Indo-Europeans carried their myths and language with them when they distributed across Eurasia, only to grow distant and acquire differences from one another over the generations. The descendants of the Pi people all seem to possess similar myths and stories in addition to the chaos comp, and it is believed these are holdovers from the days of their Proto-Indo-European ancestors. The religion of the Proto-Indo-Europeans has been attempted to be reconstructed by looking at the similarities between seemingly unrelated religions. Among these similarities found in many religions are a myth about the sun and moon riding in chariots across the sky, a creation story involving two brothers, one of whom sacrifices the other to create the world, possibly an other world guarded by a watchdog, and could only be reached by crossing a river by use of a ferryman, a world tree bearing fruit of immortality, either guarded or gnawed on by a serpent or dragon, and tended by three goddesses who spun the threads of life. From the ferryman of the underworld Charon in Greek mythology, and Yershinabai in Mesopotamian mythology, to the giant Ymir in Norse mythology and Purusha in Hindu mythology, to the three Moirai in Greek mythology and the Norns in Norse mythology. Similarities appear from all around the ancient world, and it appears at the very least these seemingly separate religions shared and exchanged ideas commonly, and or descended from a shared prehistoric religion, possibly the Proto-Indo-European religion. Again, a lot of this is unclear due to how fragmentary and mysterious history gets when we go this far back. So what is Leviathan exactly? Well, Leviathan is not a dinosaur or a crocodile, but an ancient mythological creature found in many religions and probably originated with the prehistoric religion of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. The myth was so popular that it spread and was eventually adopted by the Israelites and incorporated into the biblical canon as their own version. Leviathan is a remnant of an older age, an older religion passed down from generation to generation, and it gives us amazing insight into both the origins of religions as well as how connected the ancient world was. Leviathan is essentially just a meme that caught on. Some similarities with the chaos comp actually still exist in modern extant religions. Now one might start to notice something rather curious and reminiscent between the battle between Yahweh and Leviathan of the Old Testament and the battle between Jesus Christ and Satan or the devil specified in the New Testament, particularly the prophecies found in Revelation. Well, this isn't a mistake. The author probably models his concept of Satan in the apocalypse off of this concept of the chaos comp directly. Humans just seem to hate snakes regardless of language and country.
Very interesting. Now, we could keep going on and on and on, but I think there's enough here in this video to show it's all full of shit. And I wouldn't have gone on this journey had it not been for a Christian friend of mine who I reached out to and asked a few simple questions, which he then turned around to make it seem like I was attacking him or ridiculing him. Oh no. I was not. My mother has recently passed away. I was hoping for some answers. And by golly, thank you, because I found my fucking answers. Rest in peace, Mum. Looks like what you believed in didn't exist. But I do hope there is some kind of afterlife. I hope you're there, and I do hope you're out of pain and enjoying where you are now.
So let's take a look at what our new updated Sunday school story looks like. Around 2,000 years ago, the Romans decided that dead men could be gods and living men could be sons of gods. Meanwhile, in the backwaters of the Roman Empire, the Jewish people were waiting for their god, Yahweh, to send a warrior king they called the Messiah to kick out the Romans. But the Messiah was a no-show. Eventually, several generations later, a small fringe Jewish sect said, "This is our guy." Jesus Christ, which means Saviour the Saviour, was a very Jewish Jew, but had two problems in his messianic resume. He had not defeated the Romans, and he was already dead. A few years later, Paul, who had been busy beating up early Jesus worshippers, suddenly changed his mind and invented his own version of the Jesus sect. He reinvented the Messiah to be a superpowered celestial warrior king for non-Jews who could keep their foreskin and still get into heaven. The OG Christians weren't impressed. "This is fake news. Paul didn't even know Jesus. This is a Jews-only club, bubbler." According to Paul, Jesus spoke to him in visions, and any day now, JC would come down to earth with supernatural powers to defeat the Romans and anyone else who didn't worship him. Unfortunately, Jesus didn't return within Paul's lifetime, and despite writing lots of letters in his 30 years of missionary work, Paul never mentioned anything about Jesus' life, teachings, or miracles. But the Jews did get their war against the Romans, and got their butts badly kicked. No warrior king Messiah showed up, and their temple was torn down. The original disciples of Jesus were all dead, leaving not a single written record of what they thought about Jesus or his teachings. After the war, one of Paul's community did document some stories about Jesus, in which he appears as a human, but with superpowers and a big secret, who begs Yahweh not to let him be killed, but Yahweh ignored his prayers. Many other versions of the Jesus story were recorded over the next 100 years, none by actual eyewitnesses, or people who knew eyewitnesses, or people who knew people who... you get the idea. As time passed, these stories grew more far-fetched, suddenly including miracles like walking on water, the virgin birth, the resurrection of violent teenage Jesus, and Jesus raising people from the dead. All these authors were still certain that the Messiah would come to defeat their enemies within their lifetimes, but he still didn't come. For 300 years, various Jesus factions fought against the Romans, lions, and amongst themselves about who Jesus was and how to worship him properly, until one of these groups met with the Roman emperor and said, "Give us protection and tax breaks and we'll make you the head of our religion." "That's an offer I can't refuse," said the Emperor Constantine, and within 100 years this group managed to take control of the entire empire. They burnt competing gospels, tore down temples, killed pagan philosophers, and banned other religions, including competing versions of the Jesus Club. And that, my friends, is the slightly more accurate story of the triumph of Christianity. Amen. Well, isn't that a far more interesting story? And it's also one that's supported by historical evidence and biblical scholars.
All right. Fuck it. Let's do a bonus round. The 10 Commandments.
Which set? Which set of the 10 Commandments, I mean? As it happens, there are no less than 3 versions of the 10 Commandments administered to Moses in the Old Testament, only one of which is actually referred to as the 10 Commandments, and only 2 of which are written onto stone tablets. Now, funnily enough, as it happens, the most popular version of the 10 Commandments, the version detailed in Exodus 20, is neither referred to as the 10 Commandments, nor is it written on stone tablets in the Bible. In fact, the version that is called the 10 Commandments and written onto stone tablets is wildly different from the more familiar version and contains things like keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Yeah. We all know the 10 Commandments, but some of you may not be familiar with the 42 laws of Ma'at, 2925 BCE.
The 42 laws of Ma'at. And so, the Africans of ancient Egypt were established within the area of northeastern Africa by 3100 BC. This great and powerful African empire lasted over 3,000 years. The Africans of ancient Egypt were well versed in the areas of science, mathematics, warfare, trade, and medicine. However, they also had an extremely detailed religious and spiritual belief system. Now, the Egyptians believed in a concept called Ma'at. Ma'at was understood to be the notion of balance and divine order in the universe. The name Ma'at is generally translated into English as that which is straight. Ma'at also refers to truth, justice, and harmony. These Africans believed in the continuation of life after death in the spiritual realm. After physical death, they believed a human soul would be tested and a process of judgment would take place. In the Egyptian belief system, the heart was part of the soul, and thus the heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the Egyptian heart was lighter or the same weight as the feather, then this indicated that he or she had led a good life and therefore they would be rewarded. If the heart was heavier than the feather, this indicated that the human had led an evil life, and so severe punishment was soon to come. While this process of judgment is taking place, the soul is surrounded by the 42 assessors of Ma'at. The 42 assessors of Ma'at were spiritual beings which were charged with the role of judging the human soul. The human soul must complete the declaration that they have not broken any of the 42 laws of Ma'at. The 42 laws of Ma'at are also known as the 42 divine principles of Ma'at, or the 42 declarations of innocence. These are some of the world's oldest moral codes for human conduct. In this sense, they are similar to the Ten Commandments, which the Jewish religious tradition and the Christian religious tradition adhere to.
All sounding a little familiar, isn't it? Granted, it's not word for word, but that's not the fucking point.
The ancient Egyptian contemplated the cosmic laws and came to the conclusion that these laws that govern the world were the ideal that he wanted to apply on earth. He wanted to apply it in his life, values, social responsibility, and in his relationships with other people, animals, nature, and even gods. He wanted to see everything become as above, as below. As Thoth, the god of wisdom, said in his tablets known as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, just as the universe has supreme laws that govern and regulate it and prevent it from falling into the abyss of chaos, so also man should have laws that govern and regulate his behavior and prevent him from falling into the abyss. This is what was known by the ancient Egyptians as the 42 Laws of Ma'at, or the Negative Confessions, or the Declaration of Innocence.
The 42 Laws of Ma'at is a list of 42 sins, which the soul of the deceased can honestly say he or she has never committed when he or she stands in judgment in the afterlife. The most famous list comes from the papyrus of Ani, called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is widely translated as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, around 1250 BCE, which is often described by Egyptologists as the ancient Egyptian Bible. This book preceded the appearance of all moral codes in the Middle East cultures. It preceded the Jewish Ten Commandments, Zoroastrianism, Greek philosophy, Christianity, and Islam. In a nutshell, the 42 Laws of Ma'at are the origin of the moral code of ethical concepts and the teachings of the so-called heavenly religions. These laws are ascribed to Ma'at. Who is then Ma'at in ancient Egyptian culture? Ma'at or Ma'at? Both of the two pronunciations are correct. Ma'at refers to the ancient Egyptian concepts of truth, balance, order, harmony, law, morality, and justice. Ma'at was also the goddess who personified these concepts. The story of the 42 Laws of Ma'at This story is an essential part included in the Book of the Dead, which is a funerary text providing instructions to the soul in the afterlife. Since the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul was eternal and one's life on earth was only a brief aspect of an eternal journey, it was considered vital that the soul should have some kind of guidebook to navigate the next phase of existence. On earth, it was understood if one did not know where one was going, one could not arrive at the desired destination. The Egyptians, being eminently practical, believed one would need a guide in the afterlife, just as one did on earth. The purpose of these texts was to orient and reassure the soul of the deceased once it awoke in its tomb following the funeral. The soul would be unaccustomed to the world outside of the body and would need to be reminded of who it had been, what it had done, and what it should do next. In most depictions, the soul would be led from the tomb by Anubis to stand in judgment before Osiris, Thoth, and the 42 judges. When one's turn came, one would stand before the gods and recite the negative confessions, each one addressed to a specific judge, and then hand one's heart over to be weighed in the balances. It was thought that the heart contained one's character, personality, and intellect, and would need to be surrendered to the gods in the afterlife for judgment. The heart was placed on the scale in balance against the white feather of truth, representing Ma'at, and if it was found to be lighter, one went on toward paradise. If it was heavier, it was dropped onto the floor, where it was eaten by the monster Amet, the goddess who is called Devourer of the Dead, and the soul then ceased to exist. Prior to this final judgment, and one's reward or punishment, Osiris, Thoth, and Anubis would confer with the 42 judges. This would be the point at which allowances might be made. The 42 judges represented the spiritual aspects of the 42 districts of ancient Egypt, and it is thought that each of the confessions addressed a certain kind of sin which would have been particularly offensive in a specific district. If the judges felt that one had been more virtuous than evil, they recommended that the soul would be justified and allowed to get to paradise. Once there, the soul would enjoy an eternity in a world which perfectly reflected one's life on earth. Everything one thought had been lost would be returned, and souls would live in peace with each other and the gods, enjoying all the best aspects of life for eternity. The 42 negative confessions as a prerequisite to enjoy blissful eternity. Before one could reach this paradise, however, the negative confessions had to be accepted by the gods, and this meant one had to be able to sincerely mean what he said. The following is a translation of the 42 negative confessions by the great Egyptologist Wallace Budge from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. I have not stolen food. I have not swindled offerings. I have not stolen from God. I have not told lies. I have not carried away food. I have not cursed. I have not closed my ears to truth. I have not committed adultery. I have not made anyone cry. I have not felt sorrow without reason. I have not assaulted anyone. I am not deceitful. I have not stolen anyone's land. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not falsely accused anyone. I have not been angry without reason. I have not seduced anyone's wife. I have not polluted myself. I have not terrorized anyone. I have not disobeyed the law. I have not been exclusively angry. I have not cursed God. I have not behaved with violence. I have not caused disruption of peace. I have not acted hastily or without thought. I have not overstepped my boundaries of concern. I have not exaggerated my words when speaking. I have not worked evil. I have not used evil thoughts, words, or deeds. I have not polluted the water. I have not spoken angrily or arrogantly. I have not cursed anyone in thought, word, or deeds. I have not placed myself on a pedestal. I have not stolen what belongs to God. I have not stolen from or disrespected the deceased. I have not taken food from a child. I have not acted with insolence. I have not destroyed property belonging to God.
An objective and an unbiased researcher can clearly observe that these moral laws were the origin of any subsequent moral codes, including the assumed divine Ten Commandments. This made James Henry Breasted, the trustworthy Egyptologist, in his book The Dawn of Conscience, come to the conclusion that the Ten Commandments were derived from the 42 negative confessions of Ma'at.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's.
The superiority of negative confessions to the religious do's and don'ts. Anyone who carefully studies the 42 laws of Ma'at finds that they were written in the form of personal negative statements, not in the form of addressed imperatives and prohibitions. I have not stolen is what was planted in the mind and consciousness of the ancient Egyptian as an incentive for not stealing. Thou shalt not steal was the command which the 10 Commandments and religious thought in general imposed on man in a language of threat and intimidation. The command and the prohibition are known to be used to impose morals on people from outside authority, and therefore it is always accompanied by threats and intimidation. The language of the command and prohibition included in the threats and intimidation is not a moral language. Ancient Egyptians did not use it to impose morals on people by force. Instead, they used a language that encouraged men to do something out of inner motives, because they realized that the instinct to fear imprisoned humans in a degraded kind of existence. Also, the laws of Ma'at were not only moral rules, but they also were the essence of virtue that gods deposited inside humans. These laws are present in mankind from the beginning of creation and are transmitted from generation to generation. All that a person needs is to summon and evoke virtue from within, which is what is known by the term awakening of conscience.
All sounding a little familiar, isn't it? Granted, it's not word for word, but that's not the fucking point.
What do Emperor Xerxes, Freddie Mercury, and Ireland's richest citizen, Blonji Mystery, have in common? All of them are Zoroastrians, the ancient religion of Iran. This is one of the oldest ongoing religions and altered the course of human history by influencing Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek philosophy. But today it only has a fraction of the millions of followers it once had. So what is Zoroastrianism? What do Zoroastrians believe? And where do others fit into all of this? Well, let's find out. Zoroastrianism was born in ancient Iran at least 3,500 years ago. It all began around 1500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, with the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as the ancient Greeks called him, and so English speakers do too. While we call the religion Zoroastrianism, actual Zoroastrians tend to call it Mazdayazna, meaning worshipper of Mazda. No, not that Mazda, but it actually was named after the Mazda that I'm going to explain shortly. Zoroastrianism was the chief religion of Iran for around 1,000 years. Between the 6th century BCE and the 10th century CE, it was the state religion of 3 huge Iranian empires. The Achaemenid Empire of 300 fame, along with the Parthian and Sasanian empires. Back then, the priests of Zoroastrianism were known as Magi. The ancient Greeks thought these Magi had secret magical knowledge since they understood complex astronomy. This led to the English words magic, mage, and magician. The Magi would even show up in the Bible. According to the Gospel of Matthew, 3 Zoroastrian Magi came to visit the baby Jesus. These 3 wise men, as they are known in English, are still celebrated by Christians around the world on January 6th. Eventually, the Sasanian Empire would fall to the Muslim Arabs during their invasion of Iran in the 7th century CE, which started the decline and persecution of Zoroastrians in Iran. Following this, in the 10th century, some Iranian Zoroastrians fled to India, forming the Parsi community, named after where they came from, which the Indians called Persia. This once refugee community now forms the largest group of Zoroastrians anywhere on earth, and they've settled in quite well. One of India's largest businesses, Tata Group, was founded by Zoroastrians, and Parsis played a massive role in winning Indian independence from Britain. Zoroastrians can now be found all over the world. Historically, they've emigrated to areas such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and parts of Africa, such as the island of Zanzibar, where Freddie Mercury's Parsi parents would later emigrate from to the UK. In the last 100 years, small Zoroastrian populations have moved to the UK, US, Australia, and Canada. Today, there are about 200,000 Zoroastrians left. About 60,000 live in India, while the second largest group of about 25,000 lives in Iran. With a religion being called Zoroastrianism, I think maybe it's about time we spoke about Zoroaster. We don't know much about Zoroaster's life. We can't even pinpoint when he lived. The Greeks thought he lived 6,000 years before the death of Plato, so around 6,347 BCE-ish, while modern historians place him somewhere around 1,700 to 1,000 BCE. During this time, the peoples of Iran believed in many different gods, some of which were similar to the gods of their ancient Hindu neighbours. What we do know is that Zoroaster was the priest of the pre-Zoroastrian religion of Iran, and that he was outraged by his society. Roving bands of drunken warriors would ravage the countryside. They pillaged, tortured, and slaughtered at will. The common people lived in constant fear and misery, while priests obsessed over obscure rituals and sacrifices that offered little guidance or hope to the suffering. Zoroaster couldn't stand this injustice. So, when he was 30 years old, Zoroaster went down to a river to fetch water for a ceremony. There he received a vision from a being of pure light and goodness, Ahura Mazda, who revealed that they were the one true God. The truth of how the universe worked was revealed to Zoroaster, and he knew that it was now his divine mission to spread this truth to his fellow humans. So, what are the core beliefs of Zoroastrianism? Well, 1. Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. Zoroastrians worship one uncreated, eternal god known as Ahura Mazda, which means wise lord. Zoroaster describes Ahura Mazda as the lord of order, something completely good, loving, infinitely wise, and the creator of the world and all good things. Ahura Mazda is supported by 6 holy immortals known as the Ameshaspentas. These 6 holy immortals are normally compared to archangels in Christianity, if that helps you kind of figure out what their position is. Sometimes there is a 7th Spenta called Spenta Manu, but maybe he's also the Holy Spirit of Ahura Mazda? Sometimes Ahura Mazda also has a parent called Zurvan, who is time itself, but that's considered heresy at this point. Look, we don't have a lot of time to get into it. Honestly, it's a very old religion. There have been many different interpretations over the last 3,000 years. I'm really just simplifying and providing the most commonly accepted current beliefs. So keep that in mind, and as always, there's more information in the description. Opposed to Ahura Mazda is Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, and his evil minions known as Devas. Angra Mainyu is the complete polar opposite of Ahura Mazda. He is darkness, deceit, death, and decay. He is a corrupting parasite seeking to destroy Ahura Mazda's creation and is responsible for all negative things in the world. Ahura Mazda is light, Angra Mainyu is darkness. Ahura Mazda is the creator, Angra Mainyu the destroyer. Ahura Mazda created light, fire, compact Japanese vehicles, joy, humanity, puppies probably. Angra Mainyu gave the world disease, rust, mold, darkness, and that little piece of skin that pops up around your fingernail that hurts so much. Why, Angra Mainyu? Why? Zoroastrians think everything is a battle between these two opposites. Ahura Mazda represents the truth, Angra Mainyu the lie. For humans, life is a constant choice between the truth and the lie, which may be difficult because Angra Mainyu can be very deceiving. Before time began, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu were separated by an infinite void. They respectively lived in infinite light and infinite darkness. Then Ahura Mazda created the physical or Getig world. Angra Mainyu crawled into this new world and polluted it. They made the ocean salty, they turned the good earth into desert, killed the first human, made plants wither, and polluted fire with smoke. We now live in a time Zoroastrians refer to as the Gumezishin, or the mixture. Good and evil, truth and the lie both exist together in our world. But Angra Mainyu's presence is temporary. They are a stain on the world rather than a permanent fixture. Zoroastrians see the physical world as a trap that Ahura Mazda lured Angra Mainyu into. Now trapped in the physical world, Angra Mainyu can be defeated slowly by the good thoughts, good words, and good deeds of humans working with Ahura Mazda. 2. Heaven and Hell. Zoroastrians believe that when a person dies, their soul leaves their body. Their soul is then led to the Bridge of Judgment. Above this bridge lies heaven, below hell. Here the soul's good and bad deeds are weighed on a scale. Depending on the balance of good to evil deeds, the soul ascends to heaven, a paradise of infinite bliss called the Abode of Song, or falls down to hell to suffer, quote, long age of misery, darkness, bad food, and the crying of woe. This is called England. This is called Duzak. There is also a medium place for people who are neither good nor evil, where they kind of just float and experience nothing. Servants, as well as masters, can reach paradise. People will be judged according to how they chose to live their lives, rather than wealth or prestige. For Zoroastrians, death represents the highest form of pollution. Death only exists because of Angra Mainyu. Upon the death of a Zoroastrian, a priest will be called to perform a ceremony, after which the soul of the person will no longer be considered connected to the body. The family then says their goodbyes without touching the body, and the body will be placed on a stone slab and carried away by special corpse bearers. Since dead bodies are so polluting, Zoroastrians would never think to pollute any of the sacred elements with them, those being fire, water, earth, etc. So the traditional method to dispose of bodies, used for thousands of years, has been the Tower of Silence. Within these open-roofed stone towers, located on the top of barren hills, bodies will be laid to rest on stone slabs, as to not pollute the earth, and then eaten by vultures, normally within a few hours. The bones are bleached in the sun and quickly disintegrate into dust. By feeding the birds, the deceased offers up one final good deed of charity before crossing over the bridge. However, in the 1930s, the Iranian government banned the use of the towers, and currently towers in India are suffering from a shortage of birds due to increased urbanization and pollution. Today, many Zoroastrian communities use special burial grounds or have turned to electrical cremation, or even using solar reflectors to harness the power of the sun to break down the bodies rather than polluting fire. 3. the apocalypse. The battle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu will continue for thousands of years, but eventually a savior, or Saushant, will be born to a virgin mother who will lead people against the forces of evil and bring about the end times. The earth will be swallowed by fire, molten metal will cover everything. The good people will pass through this molten river, while the bad people will burn and be purified. The gates of hell will open, the souls of the damned will be released and redeemed, and everyone will live together in eternal bliss. Honestly, it all sounds pretty metal. Angra Mainyu, finally defeated by Ahura Mazda, and humanity's good thoughts, words and deeds will be tossed back into the black abyss they crawled out of and defeated forever. This last judgment / apocalypse is called the Frasho Kuridi, meaning renewal, as in the renewal of Ahura Mazda's originally perfect creation. 4. The 3 Gs. The most important concept in Zoroastrianism after Ahura Mazda is Asha. This is an ancient Avestan word and is difficult to translate. Asha is truth, wisdom, goodness, justice, perfection, order and progress all rolled into one word. Asha is the path of Ahura Mazda. Zoroastrians try their best to follow the path of Asha. To help humanity follow Asha, Ahura Mazda gave them Vohu Mana, or good mind. This allowed humans to recognize right from wrong. Good mind lets us see injustice and feel that it is unjust. Through good mind, Ahura Mazda gave humans free will. This means a lot to Zoroastrians because choice is extremely important to their beliefs. From our good mind, we can have good thoughts, and from good thoughts follow good words, and then good deeds. Doing good thoughts, good words, and good deeds is the core of Zoroastrian belief. Good deeds such as taking part in your community, supporting others through tough times, standing up against injustice, fighting poverty, nursing the sick, and subscribing to educational YouTube channels all help in the battle against Angra Mainyu. This is why in India, Zoroastrians are known for their support of orphanages, shelters, and many different charities. It was Zoroaster that said, "Happiness comes to them who bring happiness to others." 5. Fire. Zoroastrians see fire as the sacred symbol of Ahura Mazda. It is considered to be pure and represents the truth. Inside Zoroastrian fire temples, their priests conduct all rituals in front of fire because it shows the presence of Ahura Mazda. But the fire is never actually worshipped itself. This is very important. Zoroastrians do not worship fire. Zoroastrianism also isn't a congregational religion. Most worship is done at home, and Zoroastrians tend to only go to fire temples during the 7 holy days or festivals they have each year. The most sacred fires in Zoroastrianism need to be made up of fire from 16 different sources, one of which needs to be ignited by lightning. 6. The Avesta. The Avesta is the holy book of the Zoroastrians, and one of the oldest scriptures. It is written in an ancient language known as Avestan, which was the language spoken by Zoroaster roughly 3,500 years ago. The Avesta contains hymns from Zoroaster himself, known as gathas. These 17 gathas are deeply important to Zoroastrians, and most Zoroastrian belief is based on them. Due to the violence Zoroastrians have suffered throughout history, only a fraction of the Avesta survives today. For example, Zoroastrians believe that when Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenid Empire, he burned the royal palace at Persepolis and its library to the ground, destroying a complete copy of the Avesta, written in gold on 12,000 goat skins. This might be why he isn't called Alexander the Great in Iran, but rather Alexander the Accursed. Even more of the Avesta was lost during the Arab, Turkic and Mongol invasions of Iran. Yeah, Zoroastrians really couldn't catch a break there for a while. You can read the Avesta online for free, and a lot of it is extremely beautiful and thought-provoking. But if you're a dunce like me, you'll love this section about how hedgehogs, known as the dog with the prickly back, serve Ahura Mazda, and turtles have sided with Angra Mainyu. Or the following chapter, atoning for the murder of a water dog, which is about how you'll be punished if you kill an otter. So you should be like the prickly boy and the water dog and help fight against evil. When the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great, freed the Jews from Babylon, he not only showed the world the religious tolerance that Zoroastrian rulers would become known for, but he changed world history at the same time. For freeing the Jews, Cyrus was praised as a messiah in the book of Isaiah. This meant that Jewish thinkers were obviously quite receptive to Zoroastrians and Zoroastrian ideas. It is in that book of Isaiah that Yahweh is for the first time spoken of as a single creator god, like Ahura Mazda. The Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam owe a lot to Zoroastrianism, because while Zoroaster's teachings don't sound too revolutionary today. Ideas like one all-powerful God, a cosmic battle between a loving God and their satanic nemesis, angels and archangels, a heavenly judgment that places a person in heaven or hell, and a final cataclysmic judgment that would purify the world and bring about the kingdom of God, where the good will live in eternal paradise, which is a Persian word, were all brand new ideas at that time. This means that while small today, Zoroastrianism has influenced the most sacred beliefs of billions of people. Even George R.R. Martin borrowed some Zoroastrian thought to make his religions in A Song of Ice and Fire, as you can see here.
Lord of Light is based in part on a couple of the dualist religions that actually existed in our world. One of them, the I can never say that.
Zoroastrian.
Yeah, whatever that is, yes. And the other one.
Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds are one of the most important things in Zoroastrianism, but they can be followed by literally anyone.